The Mom Test. How to talk to customers and figure out if your business is a good idea when everyone is lying to you. Written by Rob Fitzpatrick and narrated by the author, Rob Fitzpatrick. Introduction. Trying to learn from customer conversations is like excavating a delicate archaeological site. The truth is down there somewhere, but it's fragile. With each blow from your shovel, you get closer to the truth, but you're also liable to smash that truth into a million little pieces if you use too blunt of a learning instrument. I see a lot of teams using a bulldozer and a crate of dynamite for their excavation. They are, in one way or another, forcing people to say something nice about their business. They use heavy-handed questions like, "Do you think it's a good idea?" And in doing so, they shatter their prize. At the other end of the spectrum, some founders are being too gentle, using a toothbrush to unearth a city, flinching away from digging deep and finding out whether anything of value is actually buried down there in their business idea. We want to find the truth of how to make our business succeed. We need to dig for it and dig deep. But every question we ask carries the very real possibility of biasing the person we're talking to and rendering the whole exercise pointless. It happens more than you'd ever imagine. The truth is our goal, and questions are our tools, but we must learn to wield them. It's delicate work and well worth learning. There's treasure below. Talking to customers is hard. We know we ought to talk to customers, and many of us even do talk to customers, but we still end up building stuff that nobody buys. And isn't that exactly what talking to people is meant to prevent? It turns out that almost all of us are doing it wrong. I've made these mistakes myself, and I've seen them happen 100 times over with other founders. Despite the recent explosion of startup knowledge, the process of figuring out what customers want too often unfolds as it did at my first company, Habit. We were building social advertising tech, and I was distraught. We spent 3 years working our hearts out. We'd nearly run out of investor money, and it didn't look like we'd be getting more. We'd relocated internationally to be closer to our market and had survived a co-founder being deported. I'd been talking to customers full-time for months, and then, after countless days of slog and an exhausted team, I learned that I'd been doing it all wrong, and I may as well not have bothered. The well-intentioned advice that you should go talk to your customers is ultimately a bit unhelpful. It's like a popular kid advising his nerdy friend to just be cool. You still have to learn how to actually do it. These conversations take time. They're easy to screw up, and they go wrong in a nefarious way. Bad customer conversations aren't just useless. Worse, they convince you that you're on the right path, even when you're not. They give you a false positive that causes you to overinvest your cash, your time, and your team. Even when you're not actively screwing something up, those pesky customers seem hell-bent on lying to you. This book is a practical how-to. The approach and tools within are gathered from a wide range of communities, including customer development, design thinking, lean startup, user experience, traditional sales, and more. It's also based on working with a bunch of founders, and from my experiences both failing and succeeding at customer learning when I set out to do it myself. Plus, of course, from the support and help of innumerable peers and mentors. The approach in this book is a casual approach to conversation, based on chipping away at the formality and the awkwardness of talking to people and taking full responsibility for asking good questions. Why another book on talking and selling? Does your bookshelf really need another book on this stuff? And does it need one written by me in particular? Well, yes, I think it does, and here's why. Firstly, I'm a techie, not a sales guy. I'm naturally introverted and had no experience in meetings till I got thrown into it in my first business. Every other sales book I tried to read was written by and for people who were already pretty good at dealing with sales and people in meetings. They know the unspoken rules, and I fumbled through from scratch, making every mistake and trying to figure it all out. You know that line, "Don't call me, I'll call you"? People have actually said that to me, and I believed them. With much help from my peers and my advisors, I finally started figuring this stuff out and was able to close sales deals with companies like Sony and MTV. But I learned that there's a big gap between textbooks and checkbooks. The second reason why I think this book will be useful for you is that before you can start doing things correctly, you need to understand how you're currently doing them wrong. Through my own projects and my work with new founders, I've built up an exhaustive list of all the ways it can go wrong. Throughout the book, I'll try to help you see where you might be messing stuff up in unnoticed ways. Finally, this is a practical handbook, not a theoretical tome. For example, how do you find people to talk to and set up the meetings? How do you take notes while still being polite and paying attention? It's all in here. I cannot teach you how to make your business a huge success. That's up to you. But I can give you the tools to talk to customers, navigate through the noise and false signals, and learn what they really want. The saddest thing that can happen to a startup is for nobody to care when it disappears. We're going to make sure that doesn't happen to you. A note on scope and terminology. This book is not a summary or a description or a reinterpretation of the process of customer development. That's a bigger concept, and it's something that Steve Blank has covered comprehensively in 4 Steps to the Epiphany and the Startup Owner's Manual. This book, on the other hand, is specifically about the actual skill of properly talking to customers and what you need to ask in order to learn from them. This sort of talking, these sorts of customer interviews, are one of the big aspects of customer development, but they shouldn't be confused with the whole process. To keep the distinction clear, I'm going to refer to chatting with people as customer conversations, as opposed to the formal process of customer development. For the most part, I'm assuming you already agree that talking to customers is a good idea. I'm not trying to convince you again, so this book is much more how than why. Let's get involved. Chapter 1. The Mom Test. People say you shouldn't ask your mom whether your business is a good idea, because she loves you and she'll think everything you do is great. That's technically true, but it misses the point. You shouldn't ask anyone whether your business is a good idea, at least not in those words. Your mom will lie to you the most, just because she loves you, but it's fundamentally a bad question, and it invites everyone to lie to you at least a little bit. It's not anyone else's responsibility to tell you the truth. It's your responsibility to find it, and you're going to do that by asking good questions. The Mom Test is a set of simple rules for crafting good questions that even your mom can't lie to you about. Before we get into it, let's look at 2 conversations with Mom and see what we can learn about our simple business idea: selling digital cookbooks for the iPad. Failing the Mom Test. So the son, you, the entrepreneur, comes up, Mom, I have a great idea for a business. Can I run it by you? And they're sort of saying, hey, I'm about to expose my ego. Please don't hurt my feelings when I share my idea with you. So Mom says, oh, of course. You're my only son. I'm ready to lie to protect you. So the entrepreneur continues, you like your iPad, right? You use it a lot. Yeah. You let me hear. Of course. It's a fact. Yes, I do. So the son says, all right, so would you ever buy an app which was like a cookbook for your iPad? What's really happening here is he's optimistically asking a hypothetical question, would you ever? And setting his ego on the line. You know what he wants you to say. So, Mom says, she's thinking, would I? She's also thinking, aren't apps supposed to, be free? And the son says, and you can share recipes with your friends, and there's an iPhone app which carries your shopping list, and videos of that celebrity chef you love. No, which is really just saying, please, please, please say yes, I will not leave you alone until you say something nice about how great my business idea is. So Mom says, oh, well, you know what, you're right. That does actually sound amazing now that I hear all of it. And you're right, the price is a good deal. It's much cheaper than a hardcover cookbook. Will it have pictures of the recipes? So here what's happening is that Mom has rationalized the price outside of a real purchase decision, which has no bearing on reality. She's made a non-committal compliment, and she's gone ahead to make a feature request just to appear that she's engaged and cares. So, but the son totally misinterprets this. He thinks this is all massively positive feedback. And goes, oh yeah, we can definitely build that feature. Thanks, Mom, love you. And he's completely misinterpreted the conversation. He's taking it as validation, when what really happened is that he completely led her there. So, Mom says, oh, well, before you go, hey, eat some lasagna, because I'm concerned you won't be able to afford food soon. So our misguided entrepreneur has a few more conversations like this, lays his ego on the line, leads people to give compliments and opinions, and becomes increasingly convinced that he's right. He quits his job, sinks his savings into the app, and then wonders why no one, even his mom, buys it, especially since he'd been so rigorous, He'd talked to customers. But doing it wrong is worse than doing nothing at all. When you know you're clueless, you tend to be careful. But collecting a fistful of false positives is like convincing a drunk that he's sober. He's more confident, but not more capable, and it's ultimately not an improvement. Let's rerun the same conversation, fixing it, and showing that if we do it right, even mom, the most biased person, can still offer great insight into whether or not our business is a good idea. Passing the mom test. Hey mom, how's that new iPad treating you? Oh, yeah, I love it. I use it every day. What do you usually do on it? So this is kind of a generic question, which probably won't be terribly valuable, but at least it's not a massively biasing question. It'll get her to start talking. Oh, I read the news, I play Sudoku, I catch up with my friends, the usual. What's the last thing you did on it? This is getting more specific. It might be off topic for what we're trying to learn, but getting into the last thing they did, a specific in the past, is a great way to get real concrete data. Mom, your father and I are planning that trip. I was figuring out where we could stay. All right, so she uses it for both entertainment and utility. That's fine. Did you use an app for that? This is a bit leading, but, it's okay to nudge people to get back onto the topic you're interested in. Oh, no, I just use Google. I didn't know there was an app. What's it called? So this might be interesting to us because, as a younger person, we kind of use the app as a the App Store as a search engine. Looking for the tool we need. Or we're just in the loop. We know about lots of apps. Whereas for mom, she waits for specific recommendations. If that's true more broadly, then finding a marketing channel outside the App Store is going to be crucial for our business. So that's a nice little nugget of insight. Son goes on, so how did you find out about the other apps you have? What he's doing here is great. He's digging into an interesting and unexpected answer to try to understand the behavior and the motivation that's beneath it. If she only has a few apps and she's very touchy about where she gets them from, then we'd love to know how that works. Oh, well, this Sunday paper has a section. It's called the App of the Week. I cut it out, I save it, I can give them to you. So this is interesting too, because, maybe you can't remember the last time you took a recommendation from a newspaper, especially for a digital tool, but it makes you think that maybe traditional PR could be a viable option. Okay, that makes sense. This is the son talking again. Hey, by the way, I saw a couple new cookbooks on the shelf. I know it's a weird question, but where did those come from? There's multiple failure points in any business idea. In this case, it's both the idea of the iPad app and it's the actual content of the cookbook. So we want to learn about most. This kind of transition can feel awkward, but usually people just go with it. Just say, hey, weird question, and boom, you're onto the new conversation topic. Mom says, it's one of those things you just end up getting at Christmas. I think Marcy gave me that one. I haven't even opened it, to be honest, as if I need another lasagna recipe at my age. All right, this is gold for 3 reasons. The first is that although we had thought of people like our mom as the perfect customer because she has lots of cookbooks and enjoys cooking, she's saying that she doesn't need another generic set of recipes. So that's worrying. But on the other hand, the gift market might be strong. She was given the recent cookbooks. And it makes me think that maybe younger cooks who don't yet know their favorite recipes, they might be a better customer segment. But anyway, let's keep digging. There's often people stop their conversations too early, typically. And it's good to keep digging underneath, dig behind the signals. Well, what's the last cookbook you did buy for yourself? You always want to push back a bit on generic answers like, I never buy cookbooks. Ask for specific counterexamples in the past. When's the last time it did happen? Oh, well, now that you mention it, I bought a vegan cookbook about 3 months ago. We're trying to eat a bit healthier, and my veggies weren't that interesting, so I was trying to find some fun ways to make them taste a bit better. So this is really interesting too. Experienced chefs may still buy specialized or niche cookbooks. So maybe there's like breaking the app up into small pieces and using a microtransaction model around various ethnic and diet foods. And the conversation would continue. If it's going well, I might raise additional topics, like whether she'd ever looked for recipes on the iPad or watched cooking videos on YouTube. It can flow for as long as both of you are having fun, and if it seems like she's clearly not a customer, you can just politely end the conversation and leave. So, you head home, you thank her, you have some lasagna, pet the dog, and this is a great conversation because regardless of whether or not she's actually a customer, you've learned a great deal about her particular customer segment. You've learned that for people like your mom, building an app and waiting for her to find it on the App Store would probably be business suicide. But you've got some good insight about either how you might change the value offering, the value proposition, or the customer segment. And that gives you some places to start, some ways to continue. So that's a useful conversation. A useful conversation. The measure of usefulness of an early stage customer conversation is whether it gives you concrete facts about your customer's life and worldviews. Those facts, in turn, will help you improve your product and your business. The original idea for the iPad app looked like this. Old people like cookbooks and iPads. Therefore, if we build a cookbook for the iPad, it will be successful. But this is very generic, and there are 1,000 possible variations on this premise. With an idea this vague, it's very difficult to answer the hard questions like which recipes to include for the first version, or how we're going to spend our limited marketing budget to make sure people hear about it. Until we get specific with an idea, every product seems like a good one. But after just one conversation with our mom, who's the most biased of all people, we have a higher fidelity vision. We now see that there are at least 2 customer segments who we might serve, each of which needs a slightly different product. We've also identified some major risks that we might need to look at and address before we commit too heavily. So 2 possibilities. We could offer niche recipes like ethnic and diets to experienced cooks who may not already know these types of cooking. Our big question in this case is how we reach them if they're not searching for apps on the App Store. But we have a possible lead with traditional PR in newspapers and magazines. A second alternative would be to make a generic recipes cookbook for younger cooks who are easier to reach via the App Store and online advertising, and who haven't memorized all their favorites yet. Of course, we haven't yet talked to any, so we have loads of questions. But we might want to start with whether this segment who isn't already in the habit of paying for expensive cookbooks will pay a premium for ours, or whether they'll think that it just ought to be free, like everything else on the internet. The first conversation, the bad one, where we pitched our idea and asked for opinions, that gave us rope to hang ourselves. The second conversation, where we never mentioned our idea and we talked about the customers' lives, that gave us actionable insight. So what was different about the second conversation? Mom was unable to lie to us simply because we never mentioned our idea. That's kind of weird, right? To find out if people care about what we're doing, we need to never mention it. Instead, we talk about them and their lives. The point's a little bit more subtle than this, because obviously, eventually, you do need to talk about what you're building. You need to show it to people. You need to pitch them. You need to take their money for it. However, the big mistake that founders make is almost always to mention the idea too soon rather than too late. You want to delay it. If you just avoid mentioning your idea, at least at first, you automatically start asking better questions. Making this one change is the easiest and biggest improvement you can make to your customer conversations. To make it a little bit more concrete, here are 3 rules to help you, which are collectively called the Mom Test. Rule number 1. Talk about their life instead of your idea. If at all possible, don't even mention your idea. Just ask them how they're already dealing with it and why they're doing it that way. Second rule. Ask about specifics in the past instead of generics or hypotheticals about the future. Instead of saying, would you ever, might you ever, could you ever, ask them what they did last time. Get specific in the past. And the third rule is to talk less and listen more. If you're spending the whole meeting talking, then you're not learning anything. You're just pitching. You got to get them onto a topic they care about, nudge them on track with good guiding questions, and then shut up, take good notes, and listen. This is called the Mom Test because it leads to questions that even your mom can't lie to you about. When you do it right, they won't even know that you have a business idea. There's some other important tools and tricks that we'll introduce throughout the rest of the book, of course. But first, let's put the Mom Test to work on some questions. Rule of thumb. Every customer conversation is bad by default. It's your job to fix it by asking good questions. Good question, bad question. All right, so we're going to run through a series of questions and talk about whether each is good or bad. In other words, does the question pass or fail the Mom Test? If it fails, why? And how could you improve it? I'm going to sort of work through this list, but if you want to think through it and treat it more like a workshop exercise, feel free to pause as we go after I give you the question and decide for yourself. Question number 1. Do you think it's a good idea? All right, this is an awful question. This is the worst. Here's my business. What do you think? Do you think it's a good idea? Here's the thing. Only the market can tell you if your idea is good. Everything else is just opinion. Unless you're talking to a deep industry expert, This sort of question just gives you self-indulgent noise with a high risk of false positives. So let's fix it. Say you're building an app to help construction companies manage their suppliers. Instead of pitching your idea and asking what they think, which is a terrible way to do it, unless you can take their money, of course, because money never lies. But if you're still in the development process, you might ask them to show you how they currently manage their suppliers. Watch them manage their suppliers, Talk about which parts of the process they love and hate. Where does the frustrations come from? When they do it a certain way, why are they doing it that way? What are they trying to achieve? Then in terms of products, if they're not happy, are they actively searching for a replacement? If so, why haven't they found one already? What's the sticking point? If they're not searching for a replacement, why not? Where are they losing money with the current tools? Is there a budget for better ones? Or are they just indifferent? Is it not that important to them? Now, take all that information that you've learned, not about your idea, but about your customer's life, and decide for yourself whether your product is correct. Rule of thumb: opinions are worthless. All right, next question. So, would you buy a product which did X? This is also a bad question. It's hypothetical. Would you? Would you ever? Might you ever? It's non-committal. You're asking for opinions and hypotheticals from overly optimistic people who want to make you happy. The answer to a question like this is almost always yes, which makes it worthless. To fix it, all you have to do is similar to the above, similar to the previous question. Ask how they currently solve X and how much it costs. Ask them how much time it takes. Ask them to talk you through what happened last time X came up. If they haven't solved the problem, ask why not. Have they tried searching for solutions on Google? Do they care at all? Rule of thumb: anything people tell you hypothetically about the future without actually paying you or giving you something of value is an over-optimistic lie. All right, next question. How much would you pay for X? This feels a lot better, but it's still a bad question. It's exactly the same as the last one, except it's more likely to trick you because the number makes it feel more rigorous and truthy. You fix it the same as the others. You should be noticing a pattern. Ask about their life as it already is. How much does it cost them? How much do they currently pay to solve it? How big is the budget they allocated? How emotional do they get about this thing when it comes up? The rule of thumb is that people will lie to you if they think it's what you want to hear. You got to keep your ego off the table, because once you reveal your ego, you get the lies. All right, next question. What would your dream product do? This one's sort of okay. It's got some good and some bad. It's good, but only if you ask good follow-ups. Otherwise, on its own, it's bad. If you think about volleyball, a question like this is the set before the spike. You're putting the ball in position so that you can ask the real valuable question. It's not helpful on its own, but it's useful overall. So to improve it, you need to understand that the value comes from understanding why they want those features. Customers' feature requests are often insane. They're just off the mark, they're silly, they're asking for stuff that they wouldn't actually use themselves. So you don't want to blindly collect these feature requests, and you're not building the product by committee. But you desperately want to understand the motivations and reasoning and thought process and goals behind those feature requests. Learn as much as you can about that, and then come to your own conclusion about which features need to be built and how. Rule of thumb: people know what their problems are, but they don't necessarily know how to solve those problems. That's your job. Next question. Oh, this seems really hard. Why are you even bothering? Why do you bother? This is a great question, and I love this sort of thing, even though it feels a bit confrontational. It's great from getting away from the perceived problem or the superficial problem to the deep, heartfelt problem that's underneath. For example, some founders I knew were talking to finance guys who were spending hours each day sending emails about their spreadsheets. The finance guys were asking the founders, hey, can you build us better messaging tools? We really need better messaging features so that we can save time. When the founders asked, well, why do you even bother sending all these emails? Why does it matter to you? The finance folks answered, so that we can be certain that we're all working off the latest version of the spreadsheets and that no one's changes are getting lost. Aha! So the solution isn't a messaging tool. What the founders ended up building was more of a file syncing and collaboration tool, somewhere between Dropbox and Google Docs. So that's a totally different feature than the customers asked for, because the customers knew their frustration, but they didn't know how to solve their frustration. These questions like, why are you bothering to do that? That's what points toward the motivations. It gives you the why. Rule of thumb, you're shooting blind until you understand the customer's goals. Next question, what are the implications of that? Like, how much does that matter? This is a good question because it distinguishes between I will pay you to solve that problems and that's kind of annoying but I can deal with it, air quotes, problems. Some problems have big, costly implications. Other problems technically exist but don't actually matter. It behooves you to find out which is which, and this sort of question can also give you a helpful pricing signal. I once had someone who kept describing the workflow I was trying to fix with emotionally loaded terms like, it's a disaster, it's the worst part of my day, and he was yelling and he was waving his arms. But when I asked him what the implications were, I was like, what does this cost you? What happens if you never get it solved? He sort of shrugged and said, oh, well, a few months ago, we just ended up hiring a couple interns to do it, and it's actually working pretty well. So as emotional as he was, the problem just wasn't that important to him. He was having fun talking about it, but it wasn't something he was urgently trying to pay to solve because he already had a good enough solution. Rule of thumb, some problems don't actually matter, even if they technically exist. All right, talk me through the last time that happened. As mentioned, this is a great question. Whenever possible, you want to be shown, not told, by your customers. You want to learn through their actions instead of their opinions. If you can watch them, that's great. If you've got analytics that show what they're doing, then that's great. But if you can't watch them and you don't have analytics, then the best you can do is to be talked through their story. Being walked through their full workflow answers tons of questions in one fell swoop. How do they spend their days? What tools do they use? Who do they talk to? What are the constraints of their day and their life? How does your product fit into that day? Which other tools, products, software, and tasks does your product need to integrate with? Rule of thumb. Watching someone do a task will show you where the problems and inefficiencies really are, not where the customer thinks there are. Next question. What else have you tried? This is a great question. What are they using now, and how much does it cost, and what do they love or hate? How much would those fixes be worth, and how traumatic would it be for them to switch to a new solution? I was once checking out an idea with a potential customer, and they excitedly said, oh man, that happens to me all the time. I would definitely pay for something which solved that problem. But this should raise red flags. They had given me a future promise statement, a hypothetical, without any commitment to back it up, so I needed to ask some more questions to figure out whether they were lying or not. So I asked them, well, when's the last time this came up? Turns out it was pretty recent, so that's a great sign. To dig further, I asked, can you talk me through how you tried to fix it? He looked at me blankly, so I nudged him further. Have you tried anything else to deal with this problem? Did you Google around for any ways to solve it? He seemed a little bit like he'd been caught stealing from the cookie jar, and he said, no, I didn't really think to. It's just something I'm used to dealing with, So in the abstract, this problem that I had, asked him about was something he would definitely pay to solve. But once we got specific into how he had tried to solve it, what else he had tried, he suddenly didn't even care enough to have Googled for a solution. And solutions do exist, incidentally. It's easy to get someone emotional about a problem if you lead them there. You say, don't you hate it when your shoelaces come untied and you're carrying groceries? And they're like, yeah, that's the worst. I hate my shoelaces. And then you go off and design your special never come untied shoelaces without ever realizing that if the person had actually cared, they would already be using a double knot. Rule of thumb. If they haven't looked for ways of solving it already, are they really going to use or look for yours? Next question. Would you pay X for a product which did Y? This is so close to being a good question, but as it is, it's bad. The fact that you've added a number doesn't help. It's bad for the same reason people are overly optimistic about what they would do. They want to make you happy. Plus, this question is about your idea. What would you pay for my idea, instead of being about their life? Fix it in one of two ways. The kind of easier one, but it's not always applicable, is to ask them to actually pay you now. But of course, if you're early in the development process, that might not be an option. And so in that case, as always, you ask about what they already do now, not what they believe they might do in the future. The common wisdom is that you price your product in terms of value to the customer rather than cost to you, and that's true, but you can't figure out the value to the customer without prodding a bit into their financial worldviews. Rule of thumb: people stop lying when you ask them for money, but until then, ask them about their life. Question: how are you dealing with it now? This is great. It's great for all the reasons we've already talked about, so we don't need to get into the details. Sometimes, though, the way they're dealing with it now will give you a joyful surprise and show you that the value to the customer is much higher than you expected. I was once talking to an agency and I was thinking our product would be worth, say, $100 per month. And when I asked them how they were dealing with it now, it turns out they had a dedicated team of 4 just working to deal with this problem. So actually, that was probably worth $500,000 a year to them, and I significantly increased my pricing as a result of that conversation. Rule of thumb: while it's rare for someone to tell you exactly what they'll be willing to pay you, they'll often give you some indications of what it's worth to them. Next question: where does the money come from? Good question, although it only really applies in the business-to-business context. You wouldn't necessarily ask a consumer this. But for businesses, it leads to an amazing conversation about whose budget the purchase will come from, who else within the company holds the power to torpedo the deal, and how you need to start to map and navigate their organization. Now, if you're terrified to ask them about money, or if they don't want to tell you, that's a sign that the conversation's not as far along as you thought it was, or they don't actually care as deeply about the problem as you believed. If someone really wants this problem fixed and they believe you can do it, then they'll happily start to reveal their finances, as long as you're in a learning mode and not in a sales mode. Once you are asking this stuff, you can also discover that you're talking to someone who isn't the budget owner. And all of your pitches will hit a lot of snags and problems and dead ends unless you can figure out who the budget owner is, who the decision makers are, and what those people care about. And eventually, as your business grows, this early knowledge that you're getting about your customer's purchasing process, that's what you start to turn into a repeatable sales roadmap, which is kind of the main criteria for being able to hire a sales team and get them to do the work that you're currently doing as the founder. Next question: who else should I talk to? Yes, great, absolutely. End every good conversation like this, and even some of the bad conversations. It can be really challenging to line up the first few conversations and get folks to take you seriously and to talk to you. But if you're onto something interesting, and if you're treating people well, respecting their time, respecting them, not trying to trick them and steal their money, your early conversations will quickly multiply via the introductions that your customers are giving you to their peers. If someone doesn't want to make intros, that's totally cool. Don't push them. That just makes it awkward. Just leave them be. When someone refuses to give intros, you're basically learning that you're either screwing up the meeting, probably by being too formal, pitching, or being clingy, or you've learned that the customer doesn't actually care about the problem you're solving. So in those cases, take that as the learning. You've learned that they don't care, or that you're screwing something up. So maybe don't believe all of the positive feedback they gave you earlier, and take everything they say with an extra grain of salt. Now, this last one is kind of an interesting special question. It's kind of a crutch that you can use early in the process when you're talking to someone friendly who kind of gets what you're trying to do. It's especially useful for technical founders and introverts. And this question is to basically ask for help. By the end of the conversation, the customer will kind of get what you're trying to do. They understand what you're trying to learn. They understand what's happening. So you can kind of just lay your cards on the table and say, hey, listen, is there anything else I should have asked you? Did I miss anything important? And people will respond really well to this. It gives them a chance to politely fix your line of questioning, and they will. But they often won't volunteer this unless you've given them permission. They'll kind of sit there politely thinking to themselves, man, this guy is totally missing the point. This question's a bit of a crutch. You can discard it as you get better at asking good questions and as you get to know the industry. But until then, asking folks to help you out, is there anything I should have asked you? It can go a long way. Rule of thumb: people want to help you. Give them an excuse to do so. All right, on to the next section here, using the mom test. You'll notice that none of the good questions were about asking what you should build. One of the recurring criticisms about talking to customers is that people say you shouldn't abdicate your creative vision, and that talking to customers is basically the same as building your product by committee. However, given that people don't know what they actually need, building a product by committee wouldn't be a terribly effective approach. Deciding what to build is your job. The questions you want to ask are more about your customers' lives, their problems, their cares, their constraints, their goals. Your job is to humbly and honestly gather as much insight and information about them as you can, and then take your own visionary leap to a solution. Once you've taken the leap, you confirm it's correct and refine it through the tools of commitment and advancement, which we'll get to in Chapter 5. It boils down to this. You aren't allowed to tell a customer what their problem is. Customers know what their problems are. They know what their goals are. But in return, the customer is not allowed to tell you exactly what to build. It's your job to take their problems and turn it into a solution. In other words, they own the problem, you own the solution. And then you obviously test that by trying to get them to use and pay for it. So before we move on to confirming that you're building the right product, let's look a little bit more at spotting and fixing some of the ways that these learning conversations go wrong. Chapter 2. Avoiding bad data. Practically everyone I've seen talk to customers, including myself, has been giving themselves bad information, and you probably are too. Bad data gives false negatives, which means you're thinking your idea is dead when it's actually not. It still has a lot of potential. And more dangerously, false positives, which is convincing yourself you're correct when you're actually doomed. These faulty conclusions come from 3 types of bad data. Compliments, fluff, which is kind of my bucket term for generic answers, hypotheticals, and basically anyone's opinions about the future. And ideas, suggestions, feature requests, opinions. So compliments, fluff, and ideas. Sometimes we invite the bad data ourselves by asking the wrong questions. But even if you try to follow the mom test, the rules of the mom test, conversations can still go off track. This could happen because you got excited and started pitching in the middle of an otherwise good conversation, or because you had to talk about your idea in order to justify the reason for the meeting itself. Or the whole conversation could just be stuck in hypothetical la-la land. These things happen. It's no big deal. Once you start to notice the problems as they occur, it's fairly easy to get back on track by deflecting the compliments, anchoring the fluff, and digging beneath the ideas. Deflecting compliments. Most of your meetings will end with a compliment. It feels good, they said they liked it. Unfortunately, they're almost certainly lying. Or even if they're telling the truth, it doesn't matter because that compliment does not equate to a future purchase. And what does the opinions matter? Like someone likes it, someone hates it, so what? Venture capitalists who are professional judges of the future, they're wrong far more often than they're right. And so even if a VC, the best in the world, if their opinion is probably wrong, then what weight could some random persons possibly have? With the exception of industry experts who have built very similar businesses, opinions are generally worthless. You want facts about people's lives and about the industry and about the world, and you want commitments that they're committing and giving you something of value and really, really using it, You don't want compliments. The best way to escape the misinformation of compliments is to avoid gathering them all together by not even mentioning your idea. However, if compliments come up anyway, or if you accidentally or are forced to mention your idea, then you just need to learn how to deflect the compliments so that you can get on with the real business of gathering facts and commitments. Before we look at how to properly deflect, here's what happens when you take them at face value. A bad conversation. And that's it. It's like X for Y, but better because of Z. You're thinking, bam, I totally nailed that pitch. And they say something like, oh, that's cool, I love it. While they're thinking, how is this relevant to me? But they're giving you a compliment because that's a polite way to end the meeting. And, you keep going, though. You don't get the hint. You go, oh, it's going to totally change the way you work. We're predicting cost savings of 35%. You're thinking, I am so great. I'm such a great entrepreneur. And they say, oh, well, it sounds terrific. Keep me in the loop. And they're thinking, man, I can't believe I keep letting these startup guys into the office. What they've given you here is a compliment plus a stalling tactic. Sounds terrific. Keep me in the loop. You're like, awesome. You're thinking you're just like Steve Jobs, but more handsome. And back at the office, you tell the rest of their team, you go, oh, that meeting went really great. They said they loved it. In fact, everyone I've talked to loved it. I really think we finally found our big idea. We found something that people want. It's margarita time. And your team 6 months later is like, hey, Rob, why do we have 0 customers still? I thought you said everyone loved it. Wasn't this your job? And you're like, I don't know. I talked to 1,000 people. I must have missed a buying criteria. Don't worry. I'll talk to them some more. We'll get it on the next iteration. And there's like the music playing behind you. It's like, you're doomed. So we want to try this again. What happened in the bad conversation is that we fell for the compliments hook, line, and sinker. So we need to start noticing the compliments, then deflecting them. A good conversation. And that's it. It's like X for Y, but better because of Z. And you're thinking, oh man, I just screwed up. I slipped into pitch mode, so I'm going to try to fix this. But of course they answer with the generic compliment. Oh, it's really cool. I love it. So this is where you start to fix it. You go, hey, listen, whoops, I'm really sorry. I got excited and slipped into pitch mode. Listen, you guys seem to be doing a really good job in this space. Do you mind if I ask you how you're already dealing with this stuff at a moment? What's happening is you didn't necessarily notice your slip, although you could have, but you should always notice when they give you a compliment. I have this mental process running in my head. Every time a customer compliments me or my product, I get incredibly suspicious of them. I'm like, I must have said something stupid to get them to compliment me in this way. They're now in a loop of compliments, empty compliments, lying. So I need to save the conversation by getting back to reality. So that's what you're doing. Hey, how are you dealing with it already? How did you do it last time? And they're like, what? Oh, well, yeah, I can tell you what we're doing. We've got a couple people who manage the process just to make sure we're all in sync. And then we use Excel and a ton of emails to keep it all moving. Anyway, I really like your idea, though. I'm sure it'll do really well. So what's happened here is we asked for facts, so they gave us facts. That's great learning. But, in the customer's head, they're like, well, I still want this meeting to end. The idea isn't right for me, so I'm going to express an interest. I'm going to give them some compliments, and, hopefully that wraps it up. But you want to keep it about them. Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard of anyone solving it quite like that. You're just ignoring the compliment completely. Can you talk me through how it actually all fits together? Like, what steps do you have to take? Can you walk me through this? This is the key to dealing with compliments. Ignore and deflect them. Focus on the fact that they're spending a lot of effort to solve this. 2 full-time staff, they're giving you all these incredibly valuable signals in their little offhand comments in these facts and answering your specific mom test questions. So you want to keep ignoring the compliments and grabbing onto the facts and digging beneath them. Whoa, 2 full-time staff? That's crazy, I never imagined it would be so important to you. Why do you bother? Get into the good questions. So, as you ask more specific questions, they're giving you more of this delicious and delightful concrete workflow data. And, you can keep the conversation going for as long as they're interested and have time. If you're early in the learning process, the meeting could end at this point quite happily. You have the learning that you came from. If you were slightly later stage and already had a product, you might continue by zooming in and showing them the product. You usually ask for permission. You go, hey, it sounds like, we're building something that sounds like it might be useful for you. Would you be interested in spending an extra 10 minutes so I could show it to you? Not pushy, because they've already given you so much by answering your questions, but you can ask for permission to make a transition into a sales meeting. But early stage is fine. You're learning. That's a great meeting. That's a great conversation. Big success. But notice how much of that came from your follow-up questions. If you just pitch and ask for an opinion, you get basically nothing. You get worse than nothing. If you just ask 1 or 2 questions, people are giving you all these valuable signals, and it's foolish if you then leave those signals on the table. You've got to be on top of your game of noticing the compliments as a red flag. Warning, warning, I screwed something up. And noticing these juicy facts about their life is a green flag. Whoa, there's some value here. Dig underneath it. See what more you can learn. Of course, you're not always going to end up hearing what you wanted to hear. And it's still a good conversation, even if the customer doesn't care. Your goal isn't to convince them, it's just to get to the truth. Do they care? Do they not? How does it fit into their life? So here's an example of a good conversation where they don't care. It's good because you ran it properly. So they say, hey, that's really cool. I love it. And you follow up. That's the generic compliment. So you're going to deflect it and get back to concretes. Well, can I ask you, how are you dealing with this stuff at the moment? And they say, honestly, it's just not a big deal for us. We kind of just ignore it. What they're saying here is that the implications of the problem are non-existent, and they're really not in the market for a solution. Maybe they'll be polite, they'll look at your demo, blah, 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 but they're just not that motivated. They're hugely unlikely to become an actual customer. Maybe later, once it's mainstream, they could be a mainstream adopter, like years down the line, but they're not going to be your first. And you can be happy with this conversation. You saw through the false compliment. You got to the facts behind the mirage. If the conversation was friendly, if you guys got along well, you could ask them a few more questions anyway, just to understand the mentality behind non-consumption. You could try to figure out if this is an industry-wide viewpoint or something that's unique to them. But it's also cool to just bail. Like, they're not a customer, that's great. Give them back their time. Save your own time, get out of there. So you may have noticed that in a conversation, once you start showing your product, like almost every response from the customer will contain some kind of hidden compliment. These compliments are pervasive, and they're constantly trying to trick us into believing that the meeting went well, when in fact there was no real data within it. Ignoring compliments should be easy, but it's really not. We so desperately crave validation, and as such, we're often tricked into registering compliments as if they were reliable data instead of vacuous fibs. Sometimes it's easier to spot the symptoms, like the way you respond to the compliment, than to notice the compliment itself. So symptoms in the meeting could be you saying things like, "Oh, thank you," or "Oh, I'm so glad you like it." And if you notice yourself saying that, again, warning bells should go off in your head like, uh-oh, me responding that way means they just complimented me, which means I asked a stupid question. What can I do to fix this conversation before it's too late? Back at the office, some symptoms include telling your team, "Hey, that meeting went really well." Ooh, wait, warning bells, like why? What happened? What's the data we got? If you've taken good notes, which you always ought to, it's much easier to separate like the fluffy stuff they said from the real stuff they said. Other symptoms is telling your team, "Yeah, we're getting tons of positive feedback," or everyone I talk to loves the idea." All of these are warning signs. When you say something like this, try to get specific. Why did that person like the idea? How much money would it save them? How does it fit into his or her life? What else have they tried? If you don't know the answers to these types of more specific questions, then all you've got is a compliment instead of real data. Rule of thumb. Compliments are the fool's gold of customer learning. Shiny, distracting, and worthless. Anchoring fluff. So fluff, our second category of bad data, it comes in three cuddly and dangerous shapes. The first is a generic claim, like I usually, I always, I never. The second variety is a future tense promise with no commitment to back it up. I would, I will. And the third is hypothetical maybes. I might, I could. When someone starts talking about what they always, usually, never, or would do, they're giving you a generic or hypothetical fluff. You need to ask good questions which obey the mom test to anchor them back to specifics in the past. Ask them when it happened last, or ask them to talk you through it, step by step. Ask them how they solved it, and what else they tried, and why they did it that way instead of a different way. The world's most deadly fluff is, "I would definitely buy that." It just sounds so concrete, and as a founder, you desperately want to believe that this is money in the bank. But people are wildly optimistic about what they would do in the future. They're always more positive, excited, and willing to pay in the imaginary future than they are once that actual future arrives. The first startup I worked for as an employee back in university, they hugely fell for the "I would definitely buy that" trap. They thought they were collecting feedback. Really, they were just pitching people and asking for compliments, and they subsequently lost about $10 million and went out of business. They mistook the fluffy future promises and excited compliments for commitments. They incorrectly believed that they'd proven themselves right, and then they wildly overinvested in a dumb idea. Not a dumb idea, just an idea that wasn't quite ready for the investment they put behind it. The worst type of fluff-inducing question you can ask is, "Would you ever?" Well, of course they might someday. That doesn't mean they will today. Other fluff-inducing questions are stuff like, "Do you ever? Would you ever? What do you usually? Do you think you? Might you? Could you see yourself?" These questions are cowardly, and you should never ask them. People ask them because they're trying to hedge their questions because they're afraid of a harsh response. So you're asking it in a way where they can't hurt your feelings, which is just the worst thing you can do to yourself. Because you get these fluffy, "Yeah, of course, you're so smart." It's really useless. These questions aren't exactly toxic. It kind of goes back to the volleyball metaphor of these questions can be the set before the spike. The questions aren't toxic, but the responses to the questions are low value. So the mistake is in believing the answers, but you can often use them as the set to transition from a fluffy question into a concrete one. You can use the fluffy question to get people onto the topic you care about, ignore whatever they say to it, then ask a real question now that you're on the correct topic. So here's an example of transitioning from a fluffy question to a concrete one. So you say, "Hey, do you ever X?" This is a fluff-inducing question. They go, oh yeah, all the time. This is a fluffy, generic answer which has no value in itself, but we can anchor from it. Oh, interesting. Well, when's the last time that happened? Boom, we're back into a good question. We've used the mom test and asked for a concrete example in the past. Yeah, I do that all the time. Don't believe them. Push through the generic. When's the last time? Get specific. And they say, oh, 2 weekends ago. Nice. We've successfully anchored the fluff and are now ready to get real facts instead of generics and hypotheticals. So we follow up. Hey, well, can you talk me through that? 2 weekends ago, what exactly happened? How did you deal with it? This is great. We're now in a perfect conversation. So that's like successful anchoring of fluff. To use a more tangible example, let's say you're designing some sort of inbox management tool. Here's a good conversation where you anchor the generic fluff. So they say, oh, I'm an inbox zero zealot. It's totally changed my life. I never have email sitting there. This is a generic, which means a fluffy claim, you know. I'm always at inbox zero. I don't believe you. So we say, nice. I'm an inbox zero failure. What's your inbox at right now? So by going to right now, this is an anchoring example. Like, we're getting concrete. It's not what they believe their inbox is at usually. It's like, what's it at right now? And they go, it looks like I've had about 10 emails come in since this morning. That's a fact. And we might say, wow, okay, so you are actually on top of this. I have like 200. But listen, when's the last time it totally fell apart for you? Sometimes people are usually correct in their self-belief, except for when they're not. And it's those times when they're not that really matters. For example, I might have flood insurance for my house, even though my house is not usually flooded. But when my house is flooded, that's a big deal. So I buy a product to deal with the rare, exceptional case as opposed to the usual case. So we asked them, when's the last time email totally fell apart? And they say, oh man, about a month ago, I was traveling and the internet at the hotel didn't work. It took me like 10 days to get back on track. It was a huge mess. And we might say, okay, like in our head, we're like, nice, like this is getting interesting. Now we're finding out what happens when the inbox goes wrong. And it does, even for the supposed inbox zero zealot. So we say, oh, well, can you walk me through what you did? How did you handle it? And again, we've transitioned from fluff into a great conversation. In this case, we took the generic claim, my inbox is always under control, and added the important caveat. Except when it's not, in which case it's a total nightmare to recover from and it ruins my life. When using generics, people describe themselves as who they want to be, not who they actually are. You need to get specific and bring out the edge cases. Let's say you're building a mobile loyalty app to help stores give deals and discounts to their most loyal customers. And you hear the person in front of you complaining. So this is a bad conversation where you're pitching and accepting fluff. So the person in the queue in front of you says, oh, what idiot decided it was a good idea to make me carry around 1,000 cafe loyalty cards. I have a card for Starbucks and a card for Costa. This is such a mess. And, you know, this is exactly the problem that your startup is trying to solve. So you spark up a sudden conversation. You go, oh, hello. I'm sorry to barge in, but, you know, I just so happen to be building a mobile app which helps stores give discounts to loyal customers without forcing you to carry around a ton of different paper cards. Do you think you would ever use something like that? So this is pretty much a terrible question. You've exposed your ego, you've pitched your product, and you've asked them a hypothetical would you ever. You're super doomed. This is such a bad start. And of course, they're going to say, yeah, hell yeah, it's about time. Why hasn't anyone done this already? I would definitely use that app. So this is a fluffy, hypothetical future promise. It's an empty compliment. It's the worst of the worst. By switching into pitch mode here, you just wasted a perfectly good opportunity for learning, and instead you got a fistful of fluff and garbage. So let's try again with the same serendipitous opportunity, but running the conversation properly, anchoring fluff, obeying the mom test, etc. A good conversation. So they say the same thing. Oh man, I hate having so many cafe loyalty cards. This is so stupid. And you say, you know, it's crazy, right? My wallet's like 2 feet thick. But then instead of pitching your idea, you ask them about their existing behavior. You say, hey, listen, have you ever tried any of those loyalty apps on your phone? You're anchoring to their past behaviors. And they say, what? Those exist? You know, they're thinking, wow, maybe my rage is misguided. And you're saying, yeah, I'm sure you've seen the little signs. You know, in the university cafe, there's these signs all over. In Starbucks, they're trying to get you to use an app. Like, everyone's trying to replace these paper cards. And they say, oh, you know what? Yeah, I remember seeing those. I remember hearing about it. But I'm always in such a rush when I'm in the cafe. It's not like I want to, you know, slow down and do that. And this is a cool bit of customer insight about their state of mind and their circumstances when similar products are trying to advertise to them. So we might push them a little further. We go, well, listen, we're standing in a queue. Why don't you download one right now? When people are being flaky, I like to push them to a decision, like in a friendly way, you know? It's like, hey, you could just do it. Like, what's the big deal? And if they don't care enough to try solving their problem today with a good enough solution, are they really going to care about your perfect solution tomorrow? And they might do it. They might go, you know what, you're right. I've been wanting one. And they get one, and you can have an interesting conversation then about the user experience and all of that stuff. But, most of the time what I found is people they just look for a way to weasel out of the conversation. They go, yeah, I'm low on data. I'll do it next time. And what they're basically saying here is like, as much as I like bitching and complaining, it is not an important problem for me. The implications of this problem are low, and I don't actually care about solving it. I just like complaining. There's so much customer feedback that is like that, Like you want to get real skeptical. It takes a lot of people have to care a lot to be willing to overcome the inertia of actually doing anything, changing the way they do stuff. So for your early customers, you want to be fairly skeptical. Look for the deep, urgent problems. Look for the stuff that people really care about, the stuff they're desperate for. You just really can't help but laugh when these exchanges happen. Someone's like, someone should definitely make X. And you're like, well, have you ever looked for X? And they're like, no, why would I look for X? And you're like, well, there's 10 of them already. And the person suddenly gets defensive and they're like, well, I don't really need it anyway. It's like, long story short, that person's a complainer, not a customer. They're stuck in the la-la land if they're imagining that they're the sort of person who finds clever ways to solve petty annoyances, but they're really not. So anchoring the fluff can yield useful signals. You might say, hey, well, have you ever tried any of these loyalty apps? And, instead of saying, no, I don't care, they might say something really useful like, yeah, I downloaded a couple of them. You need a different one for every cafe store. Like, I don't want 100 apps any more than I want 100 cards. So this is interesting. He's an actively searching potential user, but you would need all of the cafes that he frequents in order for him to be happy. Like, the key feature for this particular user is that you have all the cafes in one app. So maybe then you could focus on getting critical mass within one geography, like within one university town as a way to get started. Or the user might say, oh, I looked into those loyalty apps, but you only get like a 10% discount. That seems less like a loyalty reward and more like a cheap way for them to collect all my data. I don't want that. So this particular user was on the fence but needs better perks. 10% isn't quite enough, but something more might be. Maybe we could find a way to force merchants to give deeper discounts like Groupon was able to do. And this user also has privacy concerns. Another similar person might say, man, have you ever tried using those loyalty apps? They are abysmal. It takes longer to find the stupid button than to buy my coffee. It looks like it was designed by monkeys. So you're like, okay, so all you need to do to win that user is to out-execute and simplify. The list goes on. There's a ton of useful responses you can get. Even learning that a person is a non-consumer is useful. To get toward these truths, you just need to reject their generic claims, reject their incidental complaints, reject their fluffy promises, and instead anchor them onto the life they already lead and the actions they're already taking. Digging beneath ideas. Entrepreneurs are always drowning in ideas. You probably have too many ideas, not too few. Still, the people that you're asking for feedback, they adore giving you more. At some point during a good conversation, the person you're talking to may flip to your side of the table. This is good news. They're excited, they see the potential, and they'll start listing tons of ideas and possibilities and feature requests. Write these features down, but don't rush to add them to your to-do list. Startups are about focusing and executing on a single scalable idea, rather than jumping on every good possibility which crosses your desk. Let's say you're mid-conversation when this idea drops. Oh, are you guys going to be able to sync to Excel? I really think that's the killer feature. What do you do here? Well, the wrong response is to add sync to Excel to your to-do list and then move on. That's the fast lane to feature creep. Instead, take a moment to dig into the motivations behind the request. So you might reply with, well, what would syncing to Excel allow you to do? In your head, you're thinking maybe there's an easier way that I can help you achieve the same thing. And they say, well, we've got these legacy reports, and we need to go through them every now and then. It would be super nice to have everything in one place, you know? And, okay, they've got a legitimate reason, but what I'm hearing in my head is that this is not a key buying criteria. I can do that in version 2. I can do that later. This is a nice to have, not a must have. Or they might say, well, we tried a bunch of these things, and it's always the syncing to Excel that kills it. That's why we haven't been able to use any of the other offerings in this space. So this is totally different. In this case, they're actively searching for solutions, and all of the other solutions are missing a must-have feature, which could be your major differentiator. You would need to obviously talk to more people, but this is really intriguing. Or they might say, well, we have a decent workaround, as you saw, but it takes nearly a week at the end of each month to pull together all the reports. It's a big pain, and it totally stalls our work. This is cool, too. They've cobbled together a homebrew solution, which shows they care. They also know it's costing them money. This sort of person is ideally suited to being an early customer because they're already spending and trying to fix it. If I hear something like this, they've cobbled together a workaround, I'm so excited. This is one of my favorite things to hear. At my first company, Habit, when we were starting to sell our product to enterprise companies, MTV told us, and they were a paying customer at the time, so I took them really seriously. MTV said they needed analytics and reports for their campaigns. We were building advertising tech, social advertising. And I made a huge mistake upon hearing this feature request by accepting it at face value and telling my team we had to build it. Our customer needs this. We have to do it. Drop everything. This is critical. Huge mistake. So the next time I went back to MTV, I had this, shiny dashboard. It took a long time to build, like a month or two of dedicated engineering effort, which is really expensive. And when I showed it to them, they oohed and awed and said it was amazing. And I left thinking that we had nailed it. We'd built a ton of options. It was really powerful. It could carve up and examine the data every way you wanted to. It was technically impressive. It was aesthetically lovely. We were really proud of it. Unfortunately, 90% of what we had built was completely irrelevant. We just didn't know it yet. They started calling me every Friday, asking me to email over a CSV, a data file of the week's stats. So, we dutifully took that as a feature request and added CSV export to our dashboard. But they still kept calling me and saying, hey, could you just email it to me? I say, okay, I will, but, we've got this dashboard. After a few weeks, they asked for the ability to get their data as a PDF. So we obediently built PDF export, which took a little longer. Weeks later, they were still calling every Friday and asking me to export and send over the same analytics. And every week I would explain again that, hey, there's this awesome dashboard and we worked really hard on it so you can get your data whenever you want. And eventually I got frustrated, and I was like, listen, why do you even want this? Like, why does it need to be a PDF? Why does it need your logo? I was angry. So I was just like, I blew up at them. And they were really surprised, and they were like, oh, listen, we don't even look at the analytics. It's just everyone on the team likes to, have something. It looks good. It feels good. We know there's progress, and we think it would look a little bit better if it was a PDF instead of a spreadsheet. And I was like, oh man, I screwed up so badly. I just wasted like 3 months of my team's time because I didn't understand the motivation behind the feature request. Consider how much easier our lives would have been if we'd understood what they really wanted. Instead of building all that tech, we could have just hired an intern to build a beautiful report once per week and email it to them. They would have been happier. We would have saved 3 months and, probably $60,000. And our business would have moved that much faster. We would have had that money to do other more useful things. Whenever you get a feature request or a suggestion, it's your job to understand the motivations which led to it. The way you do that is by digging around the question to try to find the root cause. Why do they bother doing it the way they're currently doing it? Why do they want the feature? How are they coping without the feature? How would the feature change their lives? Why does it matter to them? Dig. You should dig in the same way around emotional signals to understand where they're coming from. If you see someone's embarrassed or angry or overjoyed, dig, where's that emotion coming from? There's so much crucial data about their worldview and their decision-making process hidden behind these emotional signals. I once overheard a founder interviewing someone at a cafe next to me. I was listening in because I was curious, and the founder mentioned something, and the person he was interviewing said, oh man, yeah, that's pretty much the worst part of my day. The founder wrote it down in his notebook and then moved on to the next question. What? That's the worst part of your customer's day, and you're not going to spend a moment to figure out why? That's absolutely insane. What a waste of a great customer conversation. You've got to dig. So, some questions to dig into feature requests. Why do you want that? What would that let you do? How are you coping without that? Do you think we should delay the launch to add that feature, or is it something we could add in version 2? How would that fit into your day? And then some questions to dig into the emotional signals when you see someone's angry, excited, etc. Tell me more about that. This seems to really bug you. I bet there's a story here. What makes this so awful? Why haven't you been able to fix this already? You seem pretty excited about that. Is it a big deal? Why so happy? Go on. These nudges don't need to be complicated. People love talking about their opinions and emotions. Digging into a signal is basically just giving them permission to do a brain dump. Go on. Keep talking. What else? That stuff works. It's enough, and you'd be shocked at how many people don't do it. Rule of thumb. Ideas and feature requests should be understood, but not obeyed. Avoiding approval seeking. As we've seen, compliments are dangerous and sneaky. So if we can nip them in the bud before they bloom, so much the better. The main source of compliment creation is seeking approval, either intentionally or inadvertently. Doing it intentionally is fishing for compliments. In other words, you don't actually want contradictory information. You've already made up your mind, but you're following the process and seeking someone else's blessing to justify you taking a blind leap. Symptoms of fishing for compliments could include saying something like, "Hey, I'm thinking of starting a business. So, what do you think? Do you think it'll work?" Or, "Hey, I had an awesome idea for an app. Do you like it?" Accidental approval seeking in this way is what I call the pathos problem. It happens when you expose your ego, which leads people to feel that they ought to protect you by saying nice things. This comes up when you tell someone about an idea that you obviously care about, which is pretty much always, since otherwise you wouldn't be asking. Even if you give folks permission to be honest, and if you ask for criticism, they're still going to pull their punches. You might say like, "Hey, here's that top secret project I quit my job for. What do you think?" Or, "I can take it. Be honest. Tell me what you really think about this." But that doesn't work. To deal with the pathos problem, you need to keep the conversation focused on the other person. You need to ask about specific, concrete cases and examples. Once someone detects that your ego is on the line, they'll give you fluffy mistruths and compliments. Disregard that data. Use the mom test, refocus on the person, their life, and their goals. Folks aren't really able to lie about specific stuff that's already happened, regardless of how it's going to affect your ego. Some famous entrepreneurs don't suffer the effects of the pathos problem because everyone knows that they're an emotionally resilient superhero. This is people like Elon Musk and Reid Hoffman and Gordon Ramsay. They're all notorious for actively seeking negative feedback, and they have this aura about them. People know that their ego's not going to get damaged, so people will willingly be harsh with them. It works for them, but it won't necessarily work for you. It certainly doesn't work for me. You and I must be more circumspect in the way we ask for feedback. In short, remember that compliments are worthless, and people's approval does not make your business better. Keep your idea and your ego out of the conversation until you're ready to ask for commitments. Rule of thumb. If you've mentioned your idea, people will try to protect your feelings. Cut off and interrupt pitches. Being pitchy is the dark side of the seeking approval coin. Instead of inviting compliments by being vulnerable, you're demanding compliments by being annoying. It's when you hold someone hostage and won't let them leave until they've said they like your idea. Normally, compliments are well-intentioned, but in this case, the other person is just trying to get you out of their office. Won't take no for an answer is generally a good quality for a founder to have. But when it creeps into a conversation that's meant to be about learning, it works against you. The symptoms could be you saying something like, no, I don't think you get it. Or, yeah, fine, but it also does this. If you slip into pitch mode, just apologize. You're excited about your idea. That's good. People get it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have taken this crazy leap in the first place. But suddenly, when you find yourself 5 minutes into an enthusiastic monologue as the other person nods politely, that's bad. Once you start talking about your idea, they stop talking about their problems. All you have to do to fix it is cut yourself off and say what we mentioned before. Whoops, I slipped into pitch mode. I'm really sorry about that. I just get excited about these things. Can we jump back to what you were saying? You were telling me that dunk, 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 and you're back to the races. If they say that they really want to hear about what you're working on, you've got a couple ways to deal with it. You can promise that you'll tell them everything at the end of the meeting, or that you'll loop them in for an early demo, but that you just want to talk a bit more about their stuff and how they deal with it before introducing your idea and maybe biasing them. You can also appease their curiosity by telling them the problem you're trying to solve or your grand vision without actually going into the details of what your solution is going to be. So someone goes, oh, like, what are you trying to do? Oh, well, I'm trying to improve children's education. Anyway, we were talking about how your kid learned to read. You were telling me that, dun dun dun. So you've given them a vague space you're working in, a vision, a justification for the conversation, but you haven't biased them with details, and then you get straight back into asking about their life. That's a beautiful solution. Rule of thumb, anyone will say your idea is great if you're annoying enough about it. Talk less. You cannot learn anything useful unless you're willing to spend a few minutes shutting up, even if you have something really smart to say. After you introduce your idea, either intentionally or accidentally, the other person is going to begin a sentence with something like, so it's similar to, or I like it, but... You are going to be hugely tempted to interrupt and fix their understanding. Alternately, they'll raise a topic that you have a really good answer to. For example, they'll start talking about how important security is, and you'll desperately want to cut in and tell them you've thought about all of that already. But both of these interruptions are a mistake. In each case, the customer was about to give you a privileged glimpse into their mental model of the world. Losing that learning just to prove that you're a smarty pants is a huge wasted opportunity. You'll have the chance to fill them in later. But give them a few minutes to fully explain, why do they think this is important? Like, why is that the first objection that pops to mind? Why do they misunderstand what you're doing? Why do they not understand the difference between these two products? Let them talk and correct it later, much later. Plus, if you get into the habit of interrupting people, it's just annoying to them. People don't like it if you've asked them a question, they start to answer, and then you interrupt and correct them. That's a bad vibe, and it's going to cause them to shut up and not give you the rest of the insight you want. Rule of thumb, the more you're talking, the worse you're doing. Chapter 3. Asking important questions. Once we know about the mom test and start trying to ask non-biasing questions, sometimes we overcompensate and ask completely trivial ones. Asking someone how old they are isn't biasing, but it also doesn't move your business forward. You need to apply the mom test to the questions which matter. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels. In addition to ensuring that you aren't asking trivialities, you also need to actively search out the world-rocking, scary questions that you've been unintentionally shrinking from. The best way to find them is with thought experiments. Imagine that your company has failed and ask yourself why that might have happened. Then imagine it as a huge success and ask what had to be true to get there. Find ways to learn about those critical missing pieces. You can tell it's an important question when the answer could completely change or disprove or kill your business. If you get an unexpected answer to a question and it doesn't affect what you're doing, then it probably wasn't a terribly important question to begin with. Every time you talk to someone, you should try to ask at least one question which has the potential to completely destroy your currently imagined business. One of my companies had some legal ambiguities around content ownership. We thought we'd be okay in theory, but it lacked strong precedents, and, the few people we talked to more or less told us the same. I was always a bit nervous that we would get found out, and so I kind of avoided talking to our customers' lawyers. And then a key customer's executives were very excited, and their creatives were thrilled, and we'd even brought their stubborn tech team around to our side. I'd spent months working on this complex sale, and it finally seemed like the dozen people who needed to agree all agreed. But in all those early conversations, I'd never asked to talk to their lawyers. It was an important question which, for whatever reason, I shrunk from. And not asking it cost us the entire deal. There's no easy solution to forcing yourself to face and ask these scary questions. I once heard the general life advice that for unpleasant tasks, you should imagine what you would have someone else do if you were delegating it to them. Then do that yourself. And remember, you're allowed to ask about money. You're a startup, it's okay. Rule of thumb. You should be terrified of at least one of the questions that you're asking in every customer conversation. Love bad news. One of the reasons we avoid important questions is because asking them is scary. It can bring us to the unsettling realization that our beloved idea is fundamentally flawed, or that the major client is never going to buy. Although this sort of news feels unfortunate, we need to learn to love it. It's solid learning, and hearing it is getting us closer to the truth. If you've only got one shot, then bad news is bad news. For example, if you're bungee jumping and your cord doesn't work, then that's bad because you only get one attempt. If you sunk your whole retirement savings into opening a cafe and it doesn't work, then that's bad. You only get one shot at blowing your retirement savings. If you save up a bunch of money for your business and you spend the entire thing on the first version of your idea and it doesn't work, then that's bad. But on the other hand, the bad news stops being bad if you get multiple chances. If you saved up $50,000 for your business and you only spent $5,000 to learn that you're running down a dead end, then that's actually great news because you can still use the rest of the money to find a viable path to your goal, with the advantage of all the extra stuff that you now know. Similarly, if you have an exciting idea for a new product and you go talk to people and they don't really care about it, then that's actually a great result. You just saved yourself however much time and money it would have cost you to try building and selling it, and you can instead put that energy toward an option that's more likely to succeed. We go through the futile process of asking for fluffy opinions and fishing for compliments because we crave approval. We want to believe that the support and sign-off of someone we respect means that our venture will succeed. But really, that person's opinion doesn't matter. They have no idea whether our business is going to work. Only the market knows. Learning that you believe the wrong stuff is super frustrating, but it's still progress. It's bringing you ever closer to the truth of a real problem in a good market. The worst thing you can do is to ignore the bad news while searching out some tiny grain of validation in order to celebrate. You want the truth, not a gold star. Some of the most informative and thus best responses you can get are along the lines of, I'm not so sure about that, and, oh, well, that's pretty neat. Both of these are lukewarm responses, and a lukewarm response is actually amazing because it's a crystal clear signal that the person you're talking to does not care in the slightest. In this context, best response means best in terms of the amount of information you're learning, not best in terms of how likely you are to close a sale. In the early stages, your focus is on learning. If you're a sales guy, with a mature company and you're going door to door selling gadgets, and if someone doesn't care, then that's a bad result because you're not getting your sales bonus. But if you're trying to decide whether or not to develop, build, and promote those gadgets in the first place, then lukewarm is terrific because it gives you a crystal clear signal that the person doesn't care. It's reliable information that you can take to the bank and which is making you smarter and your business better. The classic response, which is a huge mistake, to a lukewarm signal is to up your game and pitch them until they say something nice. However, unless they're holding a check, the only thing you have to gain from convincing them are false positives. Remember, you're not here to collect compliments. Compliments are fool's gold. They're worthless. You're trying to learn the truth. And their lukewarm response already gave you the truth. They don't care. If the person you're talking to is still engaged and happy to have the conversation, it can be worth asking a couple follow-ups to understand the nature of their apathy. Is it because the problem isn't a big deal? Are they different from your ideal customers? Do they not care about your specific implementation? Have they heard too many pitches in this space and they're just worn out, like cafe owners in the aftermath of Groupon? Or are they just having a bad day and they're not in the mood to hear it? Once you've kind of understood their indifference, say a big thanks and leave them to their day. They've probably helped you out more than the guy who said he loved it. Rule of thumb. There's more reliable information in a meh than in a wow. You can't build a business on a lukewarm response. Take that stuff seriously, find another route. Look before you zoom. Another way to miss the important questions is by obsessing over ultimately unimportant nuances. We let ourselves get stuck in the details before understanding the big picture. Everyone has problems that they know about, but they don't actually care enough about to fix. And if you zoom in too quickly and lead them to that semi-problem, then they'll happily spend all day telling you about the unimportant details. Zooming in too quickly on a super specific problem before you understand the rest of the customer's life can irreparably confuse your learnings. So here's a really, really bad customer conversation. You say something like, "Hey, thank you for taking the time. We're building phone and tablet apps to help people stay in shape and just wanted to understand how you stay fit." Now, this opening isn't necessarily terrible, but, if you can avoid mentioning the idea, that's great. And they say, okay, they're thinking I never exercise, so this should be quick. And you continue with your conversation. How often do you go to the gym? Now, this is a demographic question. It doesn't give you any new insight, but it can be useful for figuring out which sort of person you're talking to, and so you can ask the right follow-up questions. They say not really ever, and they're thinking, I guess we're done here. But you're kind of not getting the signal. What would you say is your biggest problem with going to the gym? We're now starting to go horribly wrong. You've ignored their indifferent response. Yeah, I don't really care about the gym. I don't really go. And instead of trying to understand their indifference, you're plowing ahead and pushing forward into your product and your problem. So, what's your problem with going to the gym? Anything we get is going to be misleading here because they just don't care, but since we ask the question, they'll make something up to tell us. So they reply, well, I guess the time it takes to get there, I'm kind of busy, But this is crazy. This is a crazy response that we force them into it because they don't even have a problem. They don't care. They're not trying to solve the gym issue. They're not motivated. It's like it's not in their life. And they're giving you an answer which sounds plausible because you force them to. But convenience, really convenience? It's pretty convenient to do push-ups at home. And are they doing that? Well, the way you frame the question prevents you from ever learning that. You've zoomed in too quickly. But entrepreneurs typically don't notice. They're like, oh yeah, convenience, that makes sense. It's kind of validating the suspicion that they already held. So they say something like, oh, that's perfect, that's great. And could you rank these 4 issues in terms of which is most important to you in a fitness program? Convenience, personalization, novelty, or cost? It's just so crazy at this point. You're having this whole conversation. You're collecting all this, quote, feedback from someone who's not even a customer. They don't even care. But of course, you're asking, so they'll answer. Oh, probably convenience, then cost, then personalization, then novelty, I guess. The entrepreneur is thinking, all right, awesome, Well, listen, we're working on an app. It's going to let you exercise in the convenience of your own home. I think it matches the stuff you care about. Which is obviously totally missing the point and misinterpreting the bit we started with, which is that they don't care. And now we're on to fishing for compliments. So what are they going to say? They're going to say, okay, cool. Well, let me know when it launches. It's a half-hearted commitment plus a stalling tactic. And the entrepreneur leaves thinking, great, I'll send you a beta key. This is awesome. We got a user. We got a customer. And they're thinking, wow, I am never going to click on that link. The reason this conversation is so bad is because it seems like it went well if you weren't paying attention. There's specific feedback. Oh, they ranked these criteria from most to least important. Oh, they gave us the reason why they don't go to the gym. It's really easy to misinterpret this as being valuable and then to use it to justify your product decisions when in fact the whole conversation's made up. You may as well have dreamed it because you basically ran with bad questions and forced the person into giving you fake answers. So let's look at this problem with another version of the conversation, and this time we'll try to fix it when it goes off track. You can always fix these conversations, It's not about never making the mistakes, it's just about noticing and then bringing it back to a good place. So you ask, hey, how often do you go to the gym? And they say, well, never, I don't care. And you go, why not? I don't know, it's just not something I'm that worried about, I'm not trying to fix this, it doesn't motivate me. So you might ask, because again, you can push back on these generics, these nevers, these always. Well, when's the last time you did try? Have you ever joined a gym, taken up jogging, anything? And they say, oh yeah, I used to be real sporty in high school. It just hasn't been a big deal since I settled down. Chasing after the kids gives me all the cardio I need. And you're like, all right, cool, I get it. You could chat a little bit longer if they're friendly, but basically my view at this point, they're not a customer, so I'm going to leave them to their day. Go find someone who is a potential customer. The premature zoom, ignoring whether people care about the broader problem and zooming in to the specific details of your offering, it's a huge problem because it leads to data that feels like validation but is actually worthless. So it's a big source of false positives. So if we take the same conversation again, but this time instead of immediately zooming in onto exercise, we'll start a little bit more generic. And this is going to help us figure out whether fitness is even an important problem for them. Hey, thanks for taking the time to chat to me. Can I ask, what are your big kind of personal goals and focuses right now? And they say, the biggest one is finalizing my promotion at work. And the wife and I just bought our first house, so we're going to get that all fixed up and ready to go. It's exciting times. And of course, I want to find a bit more time for the wife, the kid, the family, my parents. I want to see everyone. Things have been pretty busy at work lately. Okay, so his top of mind problems are work, house, marriage, family. Fitness didn't even register. So, we can talk. You might just, whatever, you can banter. It's not a big deal. It's like talking to a friend. You're buying a house and you expect to be less busy? He's like, whatever. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. And at this point, I'm pretty sure he doesn't care about exercise, but I might ask skeptically, just to check. Is getting healthier on that list? And they might say something like, I'm actually feeling pretty good at the moment. Fine. We don't always need to start our conversations from square one of, do they care at all, like we did in this case. Sometimes we can assume that they care. Like, if I'm talking to a small business, I can probably safely assume they would like to get more customers. I can probably safely assume that the small business owner would like to have better processes and more free time. I can look at industry reports and figure out what the major problems are. If those are the cases, then I can assume my problem is important and get right into the details. But if you're not sure that that's true, either for the individual you're talking to or for the segment at large, then you might want to start these conversations a bit more broadly and try to first figure out, do they even care at all about what I'm doing? And if they do, then you can safely zoom in. The phrase, if you could get me more gigs, is basically shifting the burden from the customer to your product. Even though you found a pain, your success is dependent on a bunch of other factors, such as your ability to grow a healthy supply of paying gigs, which are a good fit for this particular speaker. Will you be able to do that? Well, it remains to be seen. This situation is easier to spot in the online advertising industry. Imagine running customer conversations with an advertiser to try to understand their pains so that you can convince them to advertise on your site. They'd sort of look at you blankly and say, listen, if you can get enough page views, we will pay you. In fact, it's such a well-established would pay to solve problem that you don't even need to talk to them to set it up. You just plug in an ad network and you're done. Same deal with affiliate commissions. If you sell a company's products, you get a cut. That's just how it works. You don't need to explore or validate or understand their problems. The risk here resides in your ability to get lots of traffic and sell lots of products, or to get lots of speaking gigs. If you can do that, your users will pay you. In all of these examples, the primary risk is in your product, not in the customer. They'll just pay you if your product gets big enough, successful enough, if you can get the marketplace to scale. So there's these two different types of risk. There's product risk, which is, can I build it? Can I grow it? And in those cases, you really have to build the prototype. You have to start small. You have to grow it from there. And then you've got the second type of risk, which is your customer and market risk. Do they want it? Will they pay me? Are there lots of people like them? You can't overlook either one. But typically most startups, most products will have more of their risk in one or other place. So prototyping is usually your tool for dealing with product risk, whereas customer conversations are an incredibly useful tool for dealing with customer and market risk. But you can't overlook either. I remember talking to a founder who'd wasted 3 months on worthless customer conversations. He wanted to start a company building gadgets that tracked the fertility of farm animals, with the goal of ultimately boosting the birth rates because you can catch some problems early, and this would then boost farm revenue. When he talked to farmers, he asked questions like, would you switch trackers if something cheaper and more effective was available? Which is basically the same as asking people if they'd like more money. The farmers said, hey, listen, if you can build this, I'll equip my whole herd. But the problem was he couldn't build it. The risk in that case was in the product. I've also seen this strike several of the recent companies who are trying to use mobile and real-time deals to drive foot traffic to bars and clubs. They run a bunch of customer conversations with bar owners who confirm that, yes, we would like more customers, and if you can send us lots of customers, we will pay you. The founders take this as strong validation. They have the problem and they committed to pay. without recognizing that the vast majority of the risk is in the product and being able to build the active, engaged audience, not in the customer and can we get paid side of things. Bars will pay, but only if you can get tons of consumers in the door. Video games are pure product risk. For example, what sort of question could you ask to validate your game idea? Do you like plumbers more than turtles? If someone says yeah, does that prove that Mario is going to be a big success? Would you like to have even more fun than you're already having in your leisure time? In video games, the way to de-risk the product is to build a prototype of the core gameplay mechanic as quickly as possible, get it into people's hands, and see how much joy it brings them. People buy games. If yours is good and you can find a way to make them notice it, they'll buy it. So you don't need to rediscover that. This isn't to say that you shouldn't talk to anyone if you're building something with product risk. In the case of the farm fertility monitor, it's good to know that the farmer doesn't have some reason to refuse to switch tech, for example. Maybe they're all locked into 10-year contracts with their previous supplier, or maybe there's some issue with cows and electronics that seems ridiculous from the outside but has prevented them from doing it in the past. You want to know this stuff, but it's not going to give you anywhere near enough certainty without accompanying it by actually building and hustling and growing the product. What all this means is that if you've got heavy product risk as opposed to pure market risk, then you just won't be able to prove as much of your business through conversations alone. You'll need to use both. The conversations give you a starting point, but you'll have to build product earlier and with less certainty than if you had pure market risk. Pure market risk is exemplified in selling software to enterprises and businesses. They have a well-defined, costly problem. They know what it looks like, they know what needs to happen, and they can tell you. If you can build it, they will pay you. In those cases, when the problem's well-defined, you can learn with not perfect certainty, but very good certainty, whether or not it's going to work before you've ever written a line of code. So, that's why sometimes you get people who are saying, customer conversations were the key to my business, and other people saying, well, they were helpful, but they're far from a magic bullet. It's often because of where the risk resides in their particular product. Prepare your list of 3 big learning goals. Before you go into a series of customer conversations, you want to pre-plan the 3 most important things that you want to learn from any given type of person. For example, the 3 things you most want to learn from your customers, the 3 you'd like to learn from investors, from industry experts, from key hires, etc. As you learn more, you want to update your list to reflect fresh questions about what you're currently trying to learn. Pre-planning these big questions makes it a lot easier to ask your questions in a way which passes the mom test and isn't biasing, because you've had a chance to think about them in advance. It also makes it easier to face the scary questions, the ones that hurt, the elephant in the room. When you run through an unplanned conversation and improvise, it's easy to get pulled into focusing on trivialities and to keep the conversation fun and comfortable and easy. But that's not necessarily what you want to do. You shouldn't make your customer feel uncomfortable, but you should be asking the stuff that matters. Decide on the tough questions ahead of time in a calm environment with your team, and then hold yourself accountable to asking them. You'll use different questions for each different type of person you're talking to. For example, you would ask customers different things than you would ask partners. Don't stress too much about choosing the perfect questions. They're going to change. Just choose something that seems important for right now, a small list of important things. Answering those questions should give you firmer footing. It will help clarify your product features, your product roadmap, your marketing plan, your sales pipeline, your customer segment. You should choose things to learn which can meaningfully impact your business and the way you do things. And as you answer them, as you progress, it'll give you a better sense of what you need to learn next. And then the following week, you choose a new, possibly overlapping set of 3 more questions. You don't need to go through the whole list with every customer. For example, you might get a few answers from the first customer, and the second kind of verifies that that's true. And then when you talk to the third, you don't even bother asking those because you already are confident in your answer. You move on to new stuff. There's a bit of overlap and repetition, but the time is valuable, and don't feel obliged to push people through a massive laundry list of low-value questions. Knowing your list of big 3, it allows you to take better advantage of serendipitous encounters. It's so common to just randomly run into a dream customer at an industry event, a meetup, wherever, and Instead of running into them and awkwardly asking to exchange business cards so you can grab a coffee just like everyone else does, it's really amazing to be able to just rattle off your most important question. It's like, hey, weird question, but how do you guys deal with this issue? I've been wondering. That brings in the learning really quickly and goes a long way toward keeping the conversation casual, the advantages of which we'll discuss momentarily. Rule of thumb, you need a list of your big 3 questions. Chapter 4. Keeping it casual. By now, we know that zooming prematurely and introducing your idea too early creates biases and delivers bad data. In Steve Blank's original book on customer development, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, he solves this by recommending 3 separate meetings. The first about the customer and their problem, the second about your solution, and the third to shift into sales mode. By splitting the meetings, you avoid the premature zoom and avoid the pathos problem. In practice, however, I found it both difficult and inefficient to set up and take all 3 meetings. The time cost of a 1-hour meeting is more like 4 hours once you factor in the calendar dance, commuting, reviewing, following up, and it's a big time commitment to ask from the customer before you're in a position to show them anything in return. If you can get away with it, great, but I was rarely able to. In the early days, asking for the initial problem conversation was simply impossible for me. I wasn't credible enough to just talk about a problem without showing anything, so no one wanted to take a meeting with me. Steve Blank recommends starting with friendly first contacts. That's a huge help, and you should definitely do that if you have them. When you ask good questions that pass the mom test, the fact that the customer is friendly will not bias your data. If you're entering a brand new industry like I was in my first business, however, and it's got high walls, you may find yourself in a situation with no friendly first contacts. Over the years, as my credibility built in the industry, I found myself able to get meetings without any real reason. People were happy just to chat, and then customer development and customer conversations got a lot easier. At that point, the 3-meeting structure was finally viable. But once I started doing it, I still wasn't sure it was a good use of my time. The founder's time is incredibly precious to a startup, and you have to put yourself where you matter most. So if the solution isn't the 3-meeting series, then what is it? You may have noticed a trend or a tone throughout the conversation examples I've given so far, keeping it casual. I'm not running formal interviews, I'm just chatting to someone as if they were a friend. Let's say I'm trying to build tools to help public speakers get more speaking gigs. We talked about this example earlier, and I bump into one at a conference. It would be foolish to try to set up a meeting. Instead, I'm just going to transition into my most important question. Hey, I'm curious, how did you end up getting this gig? As a side bonus, we're now having an interesting conversation, and I'm far more likely to be remembered and get a meeting later. When you strip away all the formality from the process, you end up with no meetings, no interviews, and overall a much easier time. The conversations become fast and lightweight in a way that allows you to go to an industry meetup and leave with a dozen conversations under your belt and a ton of learning. The structure of separating the problem, solution, and sales conversations is really helpful for avoiding biases. But it's important to realize that the first stage, the problem discussion, does not actually need to be an entire meeting. It works better as a chat, and we'll get into how to do that in a second. Rule of thumb. Learning about a customer and their problems works better as a quick and casual chat than as a long, formal meeting. The meeting anti-pattern. The meeting anti-pattern is the tendency to relegate every opportunity for customer conversation into a calendar block. Beyond being a bad use of your time and setting expectations that you're going to show them a formal pitch, over-reliance on meetings leads us to overlook perfectly good chances for serendipitous learning. Imagine you're in a crowded cafe, tapping away at your keyboard when your dream boy or girl sits down next to you. They're wearing a charming hat and they give you a friendly nod, and then they crack open a dog-eared novel which you totally love and remember reading years ago. You slam down a quick espresso to psych yourself up, and you fumble through some sort of awkward introductory monologue about, hey, you seem like a really nice person, and this is kind of weird because we don't even know each other, but maybe we should go get a coffee sometime. Like a different coffee, not the one we're drinking now, at a different place that we've scheduled. And this is obviously kind of silly,
Because the whole purpose of a first date is to talk to each other and figure out if you want to see each other again. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, you were already on a first date when you were randomly chatting in the cafe. But you messed it up by trying to over-formalize it when you could have just chatted a bit and skipped the whole first date completely. We're going to use exactly the same trick on our early customer conversations. You're going to strip away the pomp and the circumstance of the first meeting and reduce it to a chat. If you do it right, the customer won't even realize that it was something formal. They won't even realize we were talking about our idea, learning from them, interviewing them, anything. I was once considering a product idea to make office managers more efficient. I thought about the possibilities on a Friday, figured out the big questions over the weekend, and then went to an industry event on Monday. A handful of office managers were there, and without any of them realizing that we'd had a meeting, I'd learned that the big problem was really about debt collection. I thought it was about efficiency, and I was dead wrong. They felt efficient, they just hated chasing people who hadn't paid their bills. The way I got that piece of learning was by just being chatty, There were beers, it was an event, it was fun, and we were talking. We were both interested in the same industry. I would say, hey, this thing seems really annoying. How do you guys deal with it? Or, oh, is this other thing as bad as it seems? Or, oh, I read an article about your business. You're doing a great job with this. Where did you get that idea from? How does that work in practice? This sounds very much like the types of conversations that office managers would be having between themselves. And it's true. That's the tone you want. You don't want to be the guy with the clipboard. You want to be someone who's just talking to someone else who's in your industry, like a human being, like a friend. Being too formal is a crutch that we use to help secure and make ourselves feel more comfortable in an admittedly ambiguous and awkward situation. But by being formal, instead of leaving wiggle room for the unexpected, everything becomes a process. And there's a big time cost to formality. Setting up meetings is a huge waste of your time when you could have just chatted to someone right then. And also the formality tends to clobber much of the learning that you hope to achieve. So some symptoms of formality. Well, first off, thank you for agreeing to this interview. I just have a few questions for you, and then I'll let you get back to your day. Or, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much would you say? Or, all right, question number 3 of 20. Learning from customers doesn't mean you need to be wearing a suit and sipping ominous, suspicious boardroom coffee. Asking the right questions is fast, and it touches on topics that people find quite interesting. You can talk anywhere and save yourself the formal meetings until you have something more concrete to show, to pitch, to get commitments on. Or until you find someone really friendly who's happy to completely open their books and tell you all the secrets of behind the scenes of their business or their industry. At best, customer conversations are a real pleasure for both parties. You're probably the first person in a long time to be truly interested in the petty annoyances of this person's day. You don't have to be worried that they're annoyed to talk to you. If you're respectful about their time, and if you're treating them like a human being, talking to them casually and normally, they're going to really enjoy it just as much as you learn from it. Rule of thumb. If it feels like they're doing you a favor by talking to you, you're probably being too formal. How long are meetings? The early customer conversations are incredibly fast. The chats grow longer over time as you move from the early broad questions like, is this a real problem? Toward more specific product and industry issues like, which other software do you need to integrate with in order for this workflow to work? Or how does budgeting and legal work in this industry? But at the early stages, it's fast. For example, it only takes 5 minutes maximum to learn whether a problem exists and is important. Setting up a 1-hour meeting for a 5-minute learning goal is absolute madness. A bit further along, you'll find yourself answering questions which require long stories, explaining a workflow, explaining how they spend their time, explaining what else they've tried. Those are often going to take at least 10 to 15 minutes, but you can easily keep this conversation going indefinitely if it's valuable for you, because people love talking about themselves. At the extreme end, learning the details of an industry can take an hour or more. Thankfully, these are very easy conversations to run, since the other person can go into a monologue. And also, there's no risk of them hurting your feelings, so they're not worried about your ego. They're not worried about making you sad. They're just giving you facts about how the world and the industry work. There's a lot of time lost in formal business-to-business meetings, just by the arbitrary calendar block, showing up, leaving, being polite, going together to get a coffee or a tea, so sometimes those can fill more time. Once your product is more mature and you're ready to start selling something or walking through the features or giving demos, which, obviously biases your learning, so make sure you do your learning first. But at that point, you need to start carving out clear blocks of 30 plus minutes. The time gets frittered away on all the little basics, and you need that time, and you need to make sure that you have time at the end to talk about what happens next. What are they giving you? What's the next step? That sort of thing. The potential speed of the earliest conversations is one of the biggest reasons that I like to keep that stage as casual as possible and to skip the meeting. Scheduling and going to a meeting limits the speed of your learning because you can only manage to talk to a few people per week. You're doing all this commuting, all this setup. Whereas if you can keep it casual, you can easily talk to 20, 30, 50 people in a week by taking advantage of going to the places where they like to hang out. The meetups, the industry events, the right cafes, that sort of thing. Putting it together. Even with a more formal meeting, it's still wise to try to keep it as casual as possible if you're hoping to get non-biased feedback. I once had a product idea to help busy investors manage their deal flow. I knew they got hundreds of emails and applications and pitches per month, and I figured that it must be some kind of email and spreadsheet nightmare. But I wanted to keep it casual, because that's how you get the best and the least biased info. So I set up a couple meetings with investors under a different premise. I said I wanted to talk about something else. And when I showed up to the meeting, just during the small talk stage, that's when I was really hoping to learn. Because they don't know they're being interviewed. They don't know I have an idea. My ego's not on the line. So I just chatted to them. I said something like, "Hey, I was thinking, man, I'm dying under my email. And you must get so many more emails than me. These pitches, all this stuff." The investor, he laughed. He said, "Yeah, we get a crazy number. It's impossible." And so I asked how in the world he deals with all of that. I expected him to go into this emotional speech about how the email is ruining his life and he doesn't get anything done and it's a nightmare. But what actually happened is he shrugged and he pointed at a cluster of about a dozen sticky notes which were up on the wall. Each sticky note had a business name, a person's name, and a phone number. And he explained, he said, "Well, actually our analysts look at all the pitches first. They're like the junior folks in the investment firms. And so most of the inbound stuff is deleted or killed or eliminated before it even reaches us, and then once we see them, we eliminate a bunch more. We only end up with a couple that are serious contenders, and so we write their name on a Post-it note, we stick it on the wall. Every couple weeks, we give them a call to see how it's going. If it's getting much better, we move the deal forward, and if they're slowing down, we throw away their Post-it." And so I said, "Wow, that actually doesn't sound so bad. It sounds like you got a pretty good system." Oh, it was old school, but it was efficient. It worked. And he shrugged and he said, "Yeah, actually, it does work pretty well." And that was my mind blown. I'd completely invalidated the problem. This particular customer does not care at all about the problem. They've got a great workaround. It uses Post-it notes and telephones, but that doesn't mean it's not great. And that's successful learning. I disproved the idea before the customer even realized that we were having an interview. It took all of 5 minutes, it avoided biases, it kept it casual, it was just a fun chat. I didn't get any misleading data. I got 0 compliments, 0 fluff, 0 feature suggestions. Instead, I just got concrete facts about my customer. The workflow, how he deals with it, why he does it that way. The cost to him, the implications. Of course, it took me 2 hours to get those 5 minutes of learning. I had to commute across London, I had to set up the meetings. It's not perfect every time, but I still consider that a very successful meeting. I ended up throwing away that whole product idea. It was just an idle fancy. I hadn't committed much time to it. But if I was more serious about it, I would have looked for a solution. I would have said okay, well, let me go talk to your associates, the folks who are on the front line dealing with every email. Maybe I can build a tool for them. Or I could have switched customer segments, or I could have adjusted what the product was so it better fit the investors. There's always a solution. When you get bad news, it doesn't mean you have to give up. It just means there's an obstacle which you need to respect and find a way to get around. Rule of thumb. To keep the conversations casual and unbiased, give as little information as possible about what you're working on, but still find an excuse to nudge the discussion in a useful direction. Chapter 5.
Commitment and advancement. Once we've learned the key facts about our industry and customers by talking about them and their lives, it's time to zoom in again and start revealing our idea and showing some product. The bad news is that this invites nefarious compliments. The good news is that since we now have the beginnings of a product, we are in a position to cut through the false positives by asking for commitments. In sales, moving the relationship to the next stage is called advancement. It's like pushing the customer into the next step of a real-world acquisition funnel. They'll either move forward or they'll make it clear that they're not a customer. Both are good results for your learning. When you fail to push for advancement, you end up with zombie leads, potential customers, and this also applies to investors, who will keep taking meetings with you and saying nice things, but who never seem to cut a check. It's like your startup has been friend-zoned. Thankfully, you caused it, and that means you can fix it. These zombie leads come from being clingy and fearing rejection. You want to keep the friendship going with these potential customers. You don't want to say anything that could rock the boat or could allow them to reject you. And so they don't. They just keep going, and it stays friendly and it stays nice and it never goes anywhere. It never moves toward a sale. So what you need to do to solve this is you need to give them a clear chance to either commit or to reject. This is how you get out of the startup friend zone, and it's how you identify who are going to be my real first customers and who are the zombie leads. Now, the zombie leads, you may get back to them later. They may be mainstream customers, but they're probably not going to be your first customers. And they can be a massive waste of time in the early days when you really, really need to focus. As always, you are not trying to convince every person to like what you're doing. Rather, you're trying to find the people who do care about what you're doing. That's the point of offering them this yes or no decision. Once you've got the information you came for, even if it's that they don't care and they don't want it, you can leave. But you need to put them to a decision, a yes-no decision, in order to get this crucial information. So the symptoms here are a pipeline of zombie leads, and, you talk to them, they said nice things, but you're not sure exactly when or if they're going to buy. Another symptom is a product meeting where you give a demo that ends with a compliment, or a product meeting that ends with no clear next steps. Meetings which just kind of feel like they went well. It was fun. It was nice. We had a good chat. Those are almost always zombie leads. Or basically any time that the meeting ends and the customer has not given you anything of value. They haven't committed to anything. While the traditional sales world might disagree with my definitions, for the sake of customer learning, I'm going to define commitment and advancement as separate but heavily overlapping concepts. So a commitment is when the customer is showing that they're serious by giving you something they value. This could include things like giving you a big chunk of their time, giving you some of their reputation by making a key intro, or giving you some of their money. Advancement is similar. It's a little bit more abstract. Advancement means they're moving to the next step of your real-world funnel and getting that much closer to purchasing. If you have 5 meetings with a big customer, which all kind of feel the same, then you're not advancing. Advancement is clear progress toward the goal of them being a live customer. These two concepts often arrive hand in hand. For example, to move to the next step, to get advancement, you might need an introduction to your contact's boss, which is a commitment of reputation. As such, I'm going to blur them together, and I'm mostly going to talk about commitments just because that's more tangible. It's easier to understand if you don't have an intuition for sales. Rule of thumb. Customers who keep being friendly but who aren't ever going to buy are a particularly dangerous source of mixed signals. They're zombie leads, and it's your job to identify them as such and cut them out so you can spend your time with the more promising people. Every meeting either succeeds or fails. It took me a lot of years to learn that there's no such thing as a meeting which just went well. Every meeting either succeeds or it fails. You've lost the meeting and you've failed if you leave having accepted a compliment or a stalling tactic. While you might spot a really blatant stalling tactic like, let's talk after the holidays, don't call me, I'll call you, we still accidentally accept the more subtle versions every day. Such as, for example, oh, it seems really interesting. Why don't you send me a demo when it's ready? Or, oh, it looks great. Send me some more information when you can. This is essentially a non-committal stalling tactic,
attached to a compliment. And it's the default way that every meeting ends. And that's a failed meeting, even if they said nice things, because it's very hard for you to figure out whether they're an actual customer or a zombie lead. A meeting has succeeded when it ends with a commitment to advance to the next step. But you have to force that. Not in a pushy or tricky way, but you have to pop the question. Because otherwise the meetings drift along in la la land and perform their ancient duty of wasting everyone's time. If you leave with worthless wishy-washiness, it is likely that you're falling for one or both of the following traps. The first is that you're asking for their opinion about your idea. Or in other words, you're fishing for compliments. So that's the product. What do you think? The second mistake is that you are failing to ask for a clear commitment or next steps. By now, you should know how to deal with the compliments. Deflect, ignore, and get back to business. Commitments are also fairly easy to master once you know what you're trying to do. Whenever you leave without a commitment, sometimes it's because you asked and you got rejected. That's not a big deal. It happens. Not everyone is going to be a customer, and at least now you know where you stand and can focus your effort elsewhere. It's a strong negative data point, but that's still good learning and you can be happy. Getting rejected by a customer, I still consider that a successful meeting in terms of learning. I don't beat myself up over that, and you shouldn't either. The only thing you should beat yourself up over is failing to learn. Because you were too afraid to ask for a clear commitment, or because you ran the conversation in a bad way and you gathered a bunch of biased data. So good learning is great, even if what you've learned is that the customer doesn't care. The real failure is the second mistake, not even asking for the commitment. This can happen simply because it's scary and you've avoided it, but it can also happen because you haven't planned in advance what you want to ask for. And it's actually a fairly subtle issue what the correct commitment to ask for is at any given time and with any given customer, so it's really helpful to plan it out in advance. Commitment is super important. It tells you whether the customers you're talking to actually care about what you're doing. The bigger the commitment is that they're willing to give you, then the more it shows you can trust them, treat them as a real customer, and take their feedback seriously. Rule of thumb. If you don't know what happens next after a product or sales meeting, then the meeting was probably wasted, and you needed to do a better job of asking for that next step. The currencies of commitment. Commitments can be cash, but they don't have to be. Think of it in terms of currency. What are they giving up for you that they value? A compliment costs them nothing, so it's worth nothing, and it carries no data. If I come up to you, hey, do you like my hat? Yeah, Rob, it's a lovely hat. That's a compliment, right? I'm not going to take that feedback seriously. But if I say, listen, I made this, I'm manufacturing them, they're not ready yet, but you can pre-order them. €5 per hat, I'll save as many for you as you want. Suddenly you're saying, oh, I actually don't need any of those hats, but I love it, I'm sure other people will want one. Aha! By asking for a small commitment, not in a pushy way, just, offering you the chance to say yes or no, I suddenly cut through the compliment, and I get to the truth. Are you a customer, or are you just someone saying nice things and trying to confuse me? So we've got different types of commitments. We've got time, reputation, and money. A time commitment could include things like putting a clear next meeting into the calendar with well-established and meaningful goals. Or it could be asking for a bigger chunk of their time for them to, example, sit down with you, walk through the wireframes, and give you feedback. That might take a couple hours for either them or for multiple people on their team. Or you could ask for a time commitment of them promising to use a trial for some non-trivial amount of time. Or to use a trial while also committing to go through a training workshop with their team, which will take 3 hours while you explain everything and help them build these new processes. If you just say, oh, I'll send you the trial, why don't you look at it? That I don't consider to be a commitment because that's easy for them to say yes to. It costs them nothing. They're guaranteeing nothing. And then it just sits in their inbox unexamined. So you want to make sure you're asking something that they will hesitate to give you and that they'll only give you if they actually care. Following these same rules, asking for reputation commitments could be things like an introduction to their peers, their coworkers, their team, their friends, an introduction to a decision maker like a boss, a spouse, a lawyer. It could be asking them if they would like to write a public testimonial or case study. If the product doesn't exist yet, they could simply write a testimonial about how important the problem is to them, agree to let you use their name and their photo on your website. It could be working together on a pilot project, a commitment to do a public pilot project together. All of these things, they're putting their reputation on the line. Reputation tends not to work for consumers. It's really hard to engineer something that asks for that, but it works brilliantly for businesses since the introduction is such a potent form of currency in the business-to-business world. The third stage, or third type of commitment, financial commitments, is far easier to imagine, and it could be a letter of intent, a pre-order, a deposit, an actual purchase. Strong commitments will often combine several of these currencies. For example, if someone agrees to run a paid trial at a discount with their whole team, they're risking a bit of money, a bit of time, and their reputation for exposing their team to something that's still unknown. Just like compliments aren't data when you're trying to learn about a problem, they also aren't progress when you're trying to validate your product. Hearing a compliment can still be useful, though, because it's a warning flag that whoever you're talking to is trying to get rid of you. So the solution, usually, when you get a compliment that's trying to brush you off, is just offer them a chance to say yes or no. Put a commitment in front of them, see what they say. If they decline the commitment, then you know that they're probably not that keen. Rule of thumb. The more they're giving up, the more seriously you can take what they're saying. Good meeting, bad meeting. So just like we did with questions, let's look at a couple ways that meetings commonly end. We'll go through these fairly quickly, and we'll try to figure out, is this a good meeting or a bad meeting? So you show your product, and the customer says, "Oh, that's so cool, I love it." Bad meeting, pure, unadulterated compliment. Makes you feel good, but there's zero data here. To fix it, deflect the compliment, get back to business, ask for a commitment. Looks great, let me know when it launches. Also bad. It's more subtle, it's got the compliment plus the stalling tactic, treat it exactly the same way. Ignore the compliment, ask for a commitment, figure out if they're serious. "Oh, there are a couple people I can introduce you to when you're ready." Well, this one's really interesting, because if those are the right people, then that would be really valuable. But as it currently stands, we don't really know enough to evaluate it. It could be a nebulous, empty stall. So we need to ask a couple follow-up questions. First, I would want to know who those people are. Not in a pushy way, but, which people? And if they tell you and you write those names down, that's great. The more concrete you can make it, the more seriously you can take it. And then there's this incredibly vague phrase of when you're ready. That could mean anything from tomorrow to never, and you need to know which it is. So I would say, "Hey, you said you'd make the intros when I was ready. Where would I need to get to, or what would I need to show you in order for you to feel comfortable making those introductions?" And they might say, "Oh, honestly, you guys are ready now. I just need a one-page PDF that explains what you just told me in this meeting. I'm happy to do it anytime." In which case, brilliant. Treat that person like a customer. They're ready to put their reputation on the line for you. Or they might say, "Oh, when you're ready, like when you're doing a couple million a year in revenue, you've got some big case studies, you've got all of the corporate insurance, like when you're ready." And you go, "Oh, okay. So I can basically completely disregard everything you've said because you're not willing to put your neck out for me. You're just saying once I'm already successful, then you'll tell people about me." So we need to convert these fuzzy promises into something more concrete. Knowing what ready means and who the people are, it'll give you a much better sense of how serious they are, what the commitment is, and also give you some nice short-term goals and awareness of what you have available to play with. Next one. A meeting ends and the other person says, "Great, that was nice. What are the next steps?" Well, this is usually a good meeting. A classic good meeting conclusion is to discuss the next steps and figure out what you both need to do. To succeed, the meeting doesn't need to put money in your pocket. To succeed, the meeting just needs to advance to the next step, whatever that step is. Of course, it's worth noting that you need to know what your next steps are in order to benefit from this. If you have to say, "Oh, let me think about that and get back to you," then you've ruined a perfectly good meeting and missed the opportunity. Of course, even clear next steps can be a lie. Everything can be a lie. but with the next steps in your pocket, you've at least got a good fighting chance. Keep an eye out for non-committal next steps, such as, what's our next step? Oh, well, I think we should both have a think about this. Or my next step is to check with the team or find a time to chat. Although those can be sincere, in most cases, that's a lie. It's an empty commitment. It's a fake commitment that's used to stall you without actually exchanging anything of value. What if a meeting ends with them saying, when can we start the trial? Well, this is maybe a good meeting. Unlike them saying, for example, when does it launch, which is usually a stall, when can we start tends to be a step forward. Setting up new software and training staff is a big deal for most businesses. And for a consumer, it still shows a bit of keenness and excitement. For businesses especially, even a free trial can cost them serious money when you look at their staff costs. But in other cases, getting into the trial really costs nothing. I've tried countless web apps. I log in, I look around for 10 seconds, I close it, and I never think about it again. So someone offering to poke around in your software like that is really not a commitment you should care about. You need to push them to put a bit more into it. For example, spend at least 2 hours on the trial and then write up a short review of their experiences. If someone will give you a handshake agreement to do that, it means a lot more than if they're just going to poke around on their own time. As always, think in terms of currency. What are they giving up to try it out? If your trial is too cheap, you can find ways to increase its cost. For example, you could collect more data that they have to put in. You could force them to onboard more of their team before you'll allow them to try it. You could force them to go through some training or to, there's so many options. And it's a bit counterintuitive because all of the advice about usability is to remove friction from your sign-up flows. But in the earliest stages, you're not trying to get customers. You're trying to get learning about how much people want to become customers. And so in some cases, adding friction, temporary friction, back into your processes and your flows can help you identify how serious people are. If they get through all of the friction, you know they're very motivated. Okay, what if someone says, can I buy the prototype? This is obviously incredible. It's a sign that people really care. They're like, I don't care how broken it is. I've got money. Can I use it right now? This is exactly what I need. I was once having some beers with a product designer, and he was showing me a little awesome smartphone tripod thing he was designing before they were everywhere. And as soon as I'd seen it, I asked him how much it would cost for me to buy the prototype. He laughed, and he told me that it was already like his 12th prototype because people kept buying them from him. And that's obviously an incredibly good sign. What if someone says, when can you come back to talk to the rest of the team or to talk to my boss? Bingo, amazing. If you're selling anything to businesses, you're going to have to talk to multiple people. And if they won't introduce you, then it's a safe bet that you're at a dead end. Enterprise sales is tedious, but one of the most incredible perks of selling into big businesses is that these internal introductions are incredibly accurate signals, and you can get them quite early in the process. You can figure out as soon as they're willing to connect you to their boss that this person really cares, that they're serious, that they have intent to buy. So that's such an amazing advantage, and in my opinion, it compensates for all of the frustrations of selling to big companies. Whereas consumers are easy to access, but understanding what they really care about is a lot murkier, since the conversation, there's not these clear introductory commitments that they can make to really prove themselves to you. How to fix a bad meeting. The worst meetings are the wishy-washy ones that you leave with neither rejection nor advancement. You're in a no man's land, and you won't learn anything until you fix the meeting by forcing a next step or allowing for a rejection. A lost meeting, where it's wishy-washy, can often be saved by simply asking for the commitment at the end as you're being brushed off with a compliment. You don't need to be annoying or overbearing about it. You aren't trying to strong-arm folks into handing over their wallets. You're just cutting through the polite rejections to find out if they're actually on track to become a partner, investor, customer, whatever. If they aren't excited, then good news. You got the information you came for. Assimilate it, decide whether it matters enough to change your strategy, and then keep on keeping on. The goal for any given meeting is just to put the customer to a decision so that you can learn whether you found a must-have product and a real customer. And remember, this only becomes relevant in the second stage of your conversations. In the first stage, all you're trying to do is learn about your customer's life, goals, workflows, decision-making, etc. You never even need to make mention of your product. But once you are talking about and showing your product, the way that you avoid those compliments is by asking for commitments in this way. So it's a bit different than what we talked about in the first few chapters of the book. Rule of thumb. It is not a real lead and it is not a real customer until you've given them a concrete chance to reject you. Don't pitch blind. Even once you've moved on to more product-focused sales meetings, you still want to begin each meeting with some open-ended learning to get your bearings. While you may already know what the market in general cares about, figuring out this particular customer's unique situation will considerably improve the rest of the sales conversation. A bit of initial orientation massively increases your chances of closing the deal and also delivers ongoing learning for your business, even after you've shifted into sales mode. Startup sales meetings too often go like this. We do X. You want to buy it? No thanks. This sort of rejection sucks because it doesn't teach you anything. When you hard pitch like this, here it is. Do you want it? Here it is. Pay me. It gives binary feedback. You either nailed it or you didn't. They either bought it or they didn't. And that's okay when you've already proven to yourself that your product is correct, your business model is correct, your customer segment is correct. Once you're a mature, big business. But as a startup, you're still not sure if those things have settled into their correct places. You're still trying to learn, is it the correct customer? Do we have the correct features? And so hard pitching and getting this binary feedback, it's such a waste because it doesn't help you answer or improve at any of those questions. While you're still figuring that stuff out, you want to begin all of your sales meetings by asking the learning questions, which pass the mom test. Then, once you know who you're talking to, confirm that they actually do want it by trying to sell them something. This happens over both the life of your company and it also happens during every individual sales meeting. Crazy customers and your very first sale. To be honest, it's pretty weird that anybody buys anything from young startups. In all likelihood, before the year is up, you're going to either go out of business, abandon the product, or sell the company. And even if you stay the course, there's no guarantee that you can actually do what you say you can do. As such, first customers are kind of crazy. Crazy in a good way. They really, really want what you're making. They want it so badly that they're willing to be the crazy person who tries it first. Keep an eye out for the people who get emotional about what you're doing. There's a significant difference between, yeah, that's a problem, and that is the worst part of my life and I will pay you right now if you can fix it. Steve Blank calls this latter category the early evangelists. In the enterprise software world, they're the people who have the problem, know they have the problem, have already allocated a budget to solve the problem, and have even cobbled together their own makeshift solution. These customers are the ones who will commit way before it makes rational sense to do so. It's the person who will give you cash right now from a discretionary budget just to run a trial, or even as a pre-order, simply to really prove to you that it's important. Or who will lay his neck on the line and fight against his own boss and his own lawyers when they're trying to say that the tech and the product are unproven. In the consumer space, it's the fan who wants your product to succeed so badly that they'll front you the money as a pre-order and Kickstarter when all you've got is a duct tape prototype. They're the ones who will go out and tell all their friends to chip in, or to buy it. They'll evangelize it. They'll write that first 5-star review. It's the person who's reading your blog and searching for workarounds. There are 2 takeaways from this. First, when someone isn't too emotional about what you're doing, they're unlikely to be a crazy first customer. They might be an early adopter, but not the very first, or they might be a mainstream adopter who you loop back to in a couple of years. Keep them on the list, try to make them happy, of course, be respectful, be polite, let them know what's going on, but don't bet your business on that particular person cutting the first check. Secondly, whenever you do see the deep emotion, do your utmost to keep that person close. Those folks are the rare, precious fans who will get you through the hard times and will give you your first sale. Once you've learned the facts of your industry and your customers, and once you've designed the solution, start pushing for advancement and commitments to separate the dead leads from the real customers. While you're doing this, look out for the early evangelists, the ones who are emotional and who are already trying to find a way to solve it themselves. Rule of thumb. In early stage sales, the real goal is learning. Revenue is a side effect.
Chapter 6. Finding Conversations. Now that you know how to ask good questions and how to fix bad meetings, you know enough to have good customer conversations. Go out and do it. Flex your conversational muscles and talk to some people. If you're scratching your own itch with this business, you likely already know your customers. Great, talk to them. Now that you're armed with the mom test, they won't be able to lie to you, even though they know you. But what if you don't already know folks? Where do those conversations and meetings come from? Here are a few tactics, divided into two broad categories: going to them and bringing them to you. Going to them. Drumming up good conversations from cold leads is hard. It's doable, and sometimes you have no choice, but it is far from ideal. The goal of cold conversations, where you're trying to talk to a stranger, is to stop having them. You hustle together the first one or two from wherever you can, and then if you treat people's time respectfully, and if you're genuinely trying to solve problems they care about, those conversations start to turn into warm intros. The snowball is rolling. So these are transitional tactics. You should do them to get started, but you don't want to rely on them forever. Cold calls. Okay, what does it mean if you send out a cold call or a cold email to 100 people and 98 of them ignore you? Well, it doesn't mean anything except that people don't like getting cold calls, which you probably already knew. No surprise there. However, more importantly, if 98 people out of 100 ignore you, that means 2 people didn't ignore you, and you've now got 2 conversations in play. Unless your long-term plan is to sell your product via cold calls, the rejection rate is completely irrelevant at this point. It feels terrible emotionally to get rejected that much, but it does not matter. Only the successes matter. I know one team who successfully used cold LinkedIn messages to reach C-level executives of several major UK retailers. They were ignored by almost everyone in the country. They reached out to every retailer. But you only need one yes to get started. Once that person likes you, they can start making the key introductions. Beyond hard hustle, stay open to serendipity. There are lots of ways to get lucky when you're in the mood for it. Seizing serendipity. While I was considering building tools for professional speakers, one of my many product ideas, I found myself at a friend of a friend's engagement party. I heard someone across the room say, blah, 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 my talk in Tokyo next week. So what did I do? I made a quick beeline over to her, said hello, and got to chatting about her work. She left the party thinking I was a nice guy who was super interested in her speaking career, and I left with a ton of really good customer insight, without ever having to set up a meeting, cold call, or convince someone that I was worth talking to. And in the end, she ended up becoming my first committed alpha user. If it sounds weird to unexpectedly interview people, then that's only because you're still thinking of them as interviews when you should be thinking of them as conversations. The only thing people love talking about more than themselves is their problems. By taking an interest in the problems and minutiae of their day, you're already more interesting than 99% of the people they've ever met. Rule of thumb. If it's not a formal meeting, you don't need to make excuses about why you're there or even mention that you're starting a business. Just ask them about their life. Find a good excuse to talk to them. I was chatting to an aspiring entrepreneur in a cafe. Among other things, his product could help cafe owners educate their customers on the origins and backstory of the coffee beans. It kept track and shared their supply chain. He'd been hitting the pavement for 2 weeks trying to get cold meetings and getting turned away from cafe after cafe. He'd asked me to chat with him about his customer interview process and figure out if he could find a better way to make this work. And of course, we met in the cafe. 10 minutes into the conversation, I cut in and interrupted him. I was like, who have you talked to so far? And he said, nobody. Nobody will take the time to talk to me. They all just say, come back later. I asked him what he'd been doing, and he says, well, I go in, I say I'm an entrepreneur, that I have a product, that I would love to talk to the owner about it, and, they have me get out of there. Well, of course, because you're trying to pitch them. This is a learning conversation. Talk to them like a human. Talk to them like someone who, like them, cares about coffee. At about that point, the waiter was walking by, and I said, hey, excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you. Can I talk to the manager? Can I talk to the owner? And of course, the waiter was scared. I could see it, and so I apologized. I said, oh, no, it's nothing bad. The coffee's amazing, and I just wanted to ask some more and learn about the story behind the beans, where you get them from, how you think about all that.
And so the waiter said, "Oh, great, yeah, I think he'd love to talk to you about that." Disappeared for a second, came back, said, "The owner isn't available today, but the manager can talk to you." So the manager sat down. We had a great chat about what they care about and what they look for and the origins of their coffee, how it matters to them, everything this entrepreneur wanted to learn. And in the end, the manager gave us our coffee for free and told us that the owner would be back in on Tuesday. So, he'd let him know and we could come back and talk to him then. This is great, right? The entrepreneur had failed to get this conversation for weeks because he'd been trying to be too formal. He'd been putting a pitch and a meeting in front of it. Just find a good excuse to talk to people. It doesn't need to be all formal and in a calendar. The practical downside is that no matter how well a chat goes, when you do this kind of impromptu conversation, no matter how well the conversation goes, it's really difficult to transition into a sales or a product conversation, since doing so kind of reveals that you used a bit of deception and it destroys trust. So when I open a conversation in this way, I tend to consider the chat to be a throwaway. It's a one-time learning experience. I'm going to get as much as I can. I'm going to learn about the person's worldview, but I'm not going to bother trying to sell to them. You've got the ultimate excuse to talk to random people if you happen to be getting a PhD or you're doing any kind of research project. You can call basically anyone and say, "Hey, I'm doing my PhD research on the problems in your industry. It would be a huge help if I could ask you a couple of questions for my dissertation." Or if you're really desperate and you don't have a PhD, you can always be claiming to write a book and wanting to interview experts. If you do this a few times, it's nice to actually share the research back with them. Maybe there'll be some useful best practices. But, you can create these excuses that get you into a conversation. Rule of thumb: if it's a topic you both care about, just find an excuse to talk about it. Your idea never needs to enter the equation, and you'll both enjoy the chat. Next strategy: immerse yourself in where they are. When I wanted to build tools for public speakers and conference organizers, I knew a few of them. But I didn't know any of the big names. I only knew the lower and the middle tier. I didn't know the big speakers who charged, $5,000 to $50,000 per talk. And that was a problem since I thought they might be one of my best customer segments. So what I did is I hit the conference circuit. I got a flight and I didn't come home for months. I just followed conferences around Europe. The speaker's lounge became my personal customer conversation arena. I would sit in the speaker's lounge all day. I would volunteer to give a talk at the conference. That was a benefit I was working with, but I would have found other ways to get in there if I hadn't. Maybe be a volunteer at the conference, offer to help organize, find some excuse to get myself backstage where the speakers I wanted to talk to were. And by immersing myself in that room, I met a load of people. I was able to talk to them. "Oh, how did you get this gig? What do you think about it? How do you feel about the career? Is this your full-time or part-time?" And having done this, I ultimately decided that these big name speakers and the big flashy conferences were not the right customer segment for me. And that was a great result, even though I walked away. Not every conversation is going to end up in someone throwing money at you. It's just as good to find out that you're chasing a dead end. Another strategy is landing pages, which is often talked about in the lean startup circles. Joel Gasconi from Buffer is famous for having done a landing page for his startup. They describe Buffer's features, it does these things, give us your email. But I chatted to Joel because I was curious, how did you really convince yourself that this is worth doing? And what he told me was that it wasn't the raw numbers or the analytics, but each person who dropped in their email, Joel quickly responded to them and he asked them, this is from memory, so this isn't going to be exactly accurate, but he would ask them, "Hey, why do you want this so much? Why are you so interested? What's this going to allow you to do in your job?" These are great customer development questions. He's learning a lot. When he could, if someone was really engaged, he would try to get them off of email and onto a Skype call. And he said it was actually those conversations, these free-form one-to-one conversations, which really convinced him to move forward. I, as well, am skeptical of the quantitative value of landing page metrics. You typically don't get that much traffic. It's just hard to tell for sure, yes or no, I'm going to commit my future to this. But these landing pages are certainly a great way to start collecting the contact info of people who would be keen to talk about this stuff. It isolates a group who have already shown themselves to care. Paul Graham suggests that a generic launch can be a solid start for basically the same reason. Get your product out there, see who seems to like it most, and then reach out to those types of users for deeper learning. This is starting to bring the customers to you instead of going to them, but it still involves sending a mostly cold email. Coming up next, we'll look at a few strategies for how to run with this bringing them to you principle to make your life even easier. Bringing them to you. When you are finding ways to sneak into these cold customer conversations, you're always on the back foot. You made the approach, so they're kind of suspicious and trying to figure out if you're wasting their time and what you really want. Instead, the most sustainable, easy, most fun, the best way is to look for ways to separate ourselves from the crowd, to make ourselves a desirable person to talk to, so that the customers we'd like to speak to can come find us. Beyond saving vast sums of time and frustration, bringing people to you also makes them take you more seriously, and it makes them want to help you more, because you've already demonstrated your value. So the question becomes, how can you plant a flag that your customers can see? What can you offer them that will make them want to talk to you? Here are a few ideas. Organize meetups. For only a little bit more effort than attending an event, you can organize your own event and benefit from being the center of attention. Let's say you wanted to figure out the problems that human resources professionals face, HR folks. You could organize an event called the HR Professionals Happy Hour. Even if you don't have a lot of industry expertise, the simple fact that you're the person who organized the events, set the invite emails, and introduced the speaker or welcomed everyone to talk to each other if there's not a speaker, that gives you so much assumed credibility. And from then on, you're going to have a really easy time chatting to anyone in the room about their problems. Plus, they'll answer your emails. You've already given them something of value, a great event. It doesn't have to be big. Getting 5 or 10 of the right people in the room is enormously valuable. Don't focus on the vanity metric of attendee numbers. Almost nobody has ever listened to or believed me on this particular recommendation, but it's honestly one of the first things I would do if I was moving into a new industry or a new country. It's the fastest and most unfair trick I've seen for rapid customer learning, and it also simultaneously builds you a huge amount of credibility and a sales network. There's just so many benefits. The few readers who have actually done this and sent me in notes have all sung its praises. I highly recommend organizing your own events. Another option is speaking and teaching, which is obviously similar, but you're letting someone else do the organization for you. Teaching in particular is hugely undervalued as both a customer learning and also a sales tool. Let's say you're making better project management software. In that case, you've probably got both expertise and a strongly held opinion about how project management could be run better. That's the magic combination for being an effective teacher. You want to spend the time to teach. You can teach at conferences, at workshops, through online videos, blogging, content marketing, doing free one-on-one consulting or office hours with potential customers. During this time, you're going to refine your message, get in touch with a room full of potential customers who take you very seriously because you're giving them value. And you'll learn which parts of your offering and your process and your descriptions resonate before you've even built them. Then simply chat up the attendees who are most keen and transition them into being your early customers. This is a bit off topic, and I hope you'll forgive the self-promotion, but if you're interested in learning more about how to run workshops and teach, check out my other book, The Workshop Survival Guide, about how to design and run educational workshops that work every time. That's at workshopsurvival.com. Another option is blogging in your industry. Industry blogging is really powerful, and if you have a reasonably sized and relevant audience, lining up conversations is trivial. You just write a post about it and ask folks to get in touch if they're especially interested in solving the problem that you're talking about. Of course, not everyone's going to have a relevant audience, and this is one of the reasons to start blogging to your customers before you need it. Start today so that you have this asset available, a month, a year, a decade from now. Even when I still had a very small or no blog audience, I still found blogging to be helpful. When I sent cold emails, people could see from my email address, which was the same as my blog, and from my footer, that I was writing stuff, and the recipient of the cold email would often check my blog. And they would tell me that they took the meeting specifically because of what they read on my blog. So even though Google Analytics was telling me that I had 5 or 10 visitors that month, those 5 or 10 people were the 5 or 10 who I wanted to have meetings with and talk to. It was really important for cutting through the noise and getting them to take me seriously. Blogging about an industry is also a great exercise to get your thoughts in order. It makes you a better customer conversationalist and, in essence, makes you smarter within your industry. A final option is to break all the rules and get clever. I once heard of a brilliant hack from a guy who wanted to sell to top-tier universities like Stanford and Harvard. But these are notoriously difficult to reach. They're even more difficult to sell to in some cases than big enterprises. And before he could even sell to them, he needed to understand their problems, be taken seriously by the decision makers, and even figure out who the decision makers were. His solution was to organize a semi-monthly knowledge exchange call between the department heads of these top universities to talk about the challenges around his area of interest. Furthermore, he set it up as a conference call where any other universities could dial in and listen to the best practices of the big ones. But how do you get those first three big ones? Well, he called each of them, or sent them an email, he contacted them, and he told them that the other two were already going to be doing this knowledge share call and asked if they would like to join as the third participant. Of course, each of the three wanted to learn from their two peers, so they all agreed. And then everyone else followed to learn what those big three wanted. Every business is different, and that particular tactic won't necessarily work for you. Songkick, a London startup for live music that's been doing brilliantly, founded by a couple friends of mine, they got a ton of customer learning by just throwing parties for their most active and passionate users who were living in London. Those super users would come into the office, the team would mingle with them, and everyone would learn something. You can use these clever hacks. There's no reason that everything needs to go through a meeting, so try to figure out who do we need to talk to, what are we trying to learn, and is there a way that we can cut straight to that without having to go through all of the admin overhead? Creating warm intros. Warm intros are the goal. The other tactics we talked about, going out to strangers or bringing strangers to you, are very energy intensive, whereas warm intros are sustainable, easy, and completely golden. It's so much easier to talk to someone, especially to have the open-ended, casual types of conversations we're talking about, if you've been introduced through a mutual friend. It gives you a reason to be there, it gives them a reason to want to help you. The world is a relatively small place, much smaller than people expect, and everybody knows someone. You just need to remember to ask. I was talking recently to a group of graduates who needed to reach consultants, the type with the fancy suit and the big office. And these entrepreneurs, they were pulling their hair out because they'd been sending all of these emails and trying to get through, and no one would answer and no one would take a meeting. But this group of entrepreneurs were working in a co-working space full of other young entrepreneurs who were also recent graduates. So when they told me their problem, I just stood on a chair and yelled, "Excuse me, does anyone here know anyone or is friends with anyone who works at one of the big consulting firms?" A bunch of hands went up. I said, "Can I talk to you for a second? We'll buy you a beer. Come over here." A bunch of people approached us. The founders bought them some beers and had a series of quick chats, and they left with a diary of intros. This is even easier for consumer products. Not everyone knows a consultant, but everyone does know, for example, someone who's a new mom, or an amateur athlete, or a theater enthusiast. You don't need to only go through strangers. You don't need to do all this work yourself. The people you know, the people in the room with you right now, may well be able to make the intros you need if you're just willing to ask them. Rule of thumb. Kevin Bacon's 7 Degrees of Separation, the idea that through a series of connections you can reach anyone you want in the world, that applies to customer conversations. You can find whoever you need if you're just willing to ask for it a couple times. Industry advisors. I relied heavily on advisors as a source of introductions in my first company. I didn't know the industry and no one took me seriously, so they didn't want to talk to me or meet with me. One of the very best things that our investors recommended that we do was to build an advisory board, and we ended up with 5 industry experts who were amazingly helpful. I met with each of them about once a month, staggered, so I had a different meeting with a different advisor about weekly. During those meetings, I would tell them who I was trying to get in touch with, and more often than not, they would have some way to reach the person I needed. Or I would even say I'm looking for people in these industries doing these things. To figure out who those people were, each week I would buy all of the industry trade press, the industry magazines, the industry newspapers, and I'd flip through to look for PR stories about companies who were doing stuff that was relevant to us. On a bit of a tangent, you'd be surprised by the quality of folks you can get to join your advisory board. The first conversation with a good advisor looks really similar to the first conversation with an early evangelist customer. You get along, you're talking about the space, you both really care about it, they're excited about what you're doing, it's getting emotional. In this way, you can sometimes find killer advisors from your early customer conversations. That early evangelist, if they're really going above and beyond, they may actually want to be part of your company long term. Another source of introductions, warm intros, is universities. I'm super jealous of founders who are still in university or who are recently graduated. Professors are an absolute goldmine for introductions. Professors get their grant funding, their research funding from friendly, high-level industry folks. And since those industry folks are investing in research through the professors, they're kind of self-selecting themselves to be excited about new projects. That's exactly who you want to be talking to if you're trying to get into big businesses. Professors are super easy to get in touch with, even if you don't know them yet. As long as you went to the same university that they're working at, or they used to be working at, or as long as you have any connection to them whatsoever, you can get an introduction. You can go into their office hours. It's so valuable. University students have so much at their fingertips through this extended network via their professors. You gotta make use of it if you still have access to it. It's just too good to pass up. Another source of great warm intros is your investors. Top-tier investors are incredible for business-to-business intros. Beyond their own Rolodex and their own portfolio of companies, they can usually pull off cold introductions to practically anyone. Investors can also help you find a better advisory board, who can then make introductions. And they can also help you set up your company directors, who are like super advisors. This applies more generally than investors to anyone you know who takes you seriously, who's a big deal, and who has already bought into your idea. Write down a list of all these people, start thinking about what would the dream introduction be, and then talk to them. You're not necessarily going to get it right now, but you can at least learn where you would need to get to for them to feel comfortable making the intro. Another option is to cash in all of the favors that you've accrued over your life to this point. Remember all those people who brushed you off? For example, maybe an investor who you pitched and they said, "Well, it sounds really interesting. Keep me in the loop and let me know how I can help." Now's the time to call them in. Yes, they might not have actually meant it, but who cares? Worst case, you get nothing. Best case, you get a killer intro. So reply to that ancient email. Tell them you're ready for the intro to that guy they know that they mentioned before. I'll give you a template in the next chapter that you can use to write emails that are really easy for someone to use as an introduction for you. It removes all of the ambiguity and the fear. You'll get ignored a lot. But again, who cares? You aren't trying to minimize your failure rate. You're trying to get a few conversations going. The people you're being introduced to won't know the backstory anyway, so as far as they're concerned, however the intro happens, it's a clean start from there. I wouldn't make a habit out of doing this stuff since it's a bit annoying and can burn bridges, but sometimes you're backed into a corner and you really need to get started somehow, however you can manage. So remember, reaching out through cold emails is the worst case, but it works and you can hustle it if you have to. But it's a way to get started. Similarly, you can plant a flag, make yourself visible, and bring people to you. But in both cases, the real goal is to get enough momentum and credibility going that the people you're starting to talk to will make new warm intros for you to their peers, their industry, their friends. And from there, it's all easy breezy. Asking for and framing the meeting. Sometimes a proper meeting can't be avoided. For example, you might need a full hour to talk, or you need to talk to someone who's really senior and you don't know them well, so a formal meeting's the only way to do it. But since you don't actually have anything to sell, it's a little unclear from the customer's perspective what the purpose of the meeting even is. In these cases, it's your job to provide the right explanation and framing to make them feel comfortable and aware of the purpose and the goals for the meeting. If you don't establish why you're there, every meeting becomes a sales meeting by default, which is super bad for 3 reasons. First, once you're in a sales context, the customer closes up about certain important and sensitive topics like pricing because they're worried you're going to use it against them during negotiations. Second, attention shifts to you instead of being on them. They want to see your product. They want to talk about your idea. And finally, it's going to be the worst sales meeting ever because you just aren't ready yet. You don't know enough about your customers to be able to credibly get through a sales meeting. The symptoms of this are starting a conversation by saying things like, so, or how's it going, or getting stuck in small talk, or saying, well, I guess we should just tell each other about our histories, or defaulting to, well, I guess I'll show you the product. There are lots of bad ways to frame the meeting, both when first asking for it via email and also once it actually begins. Framing it like, "Can I interview you?" or "Thanks for agreeing to this interview," it sets off alarm bells that the meeting's going to be super boring. As a customer, I don't want to be interviewed. I want to talk to you. I want to help you. I want to, talk about my problems. I want to learn. The common request or framing for a feedback meeting, "Can I get your opinion on what we're doing?" This sets expectations of neediness and that you want compliments or approval. It really invites these types of bad data. But it's not about avoiding expectations. For example, no expectations at all are set by something like, "Hey, do you have time for a quick coffee, lunch, chat, meeting?" They don't know what it's for, and this suggests that you're liable to waste their time. Think about it. A stranger approaches you or someone you've just been introduced to and they're asking for a block of your time with no proposed agenda. That's going to make you really suspicious if you're a busy person. So the framing format that I like, and I use this both for my emails and also at the beginning of every conversation I take, it's got 5 elements. Let's talk through them. First, establish that you're an entrepreneur trying to solve some horrible problem, or to usher in a wonderful vision, or to fix a stagnant industry, but don't mention your idea. Talk very high level at this point. "Hey, I'm trying to improve education," or even, "Hey, I'm trying to make it easier for busy, overwhelmed teachers to create great breakthrough classroom activities." It's talking about your vision, but it's not necessarily pitching the idea or going into any details. Ideally, you wouldn't even tell them this because it does introduce some biases, but in reality, you need to give them some reason for why you're there and what you want, and this is as close as I've found to a workable compromise. Second, you're going to frame the expectations by mentioning what stage you're at, and if it's true that you have nothing to sell them. If you are going to try to sell them something, then obviously don't say that. Next up, you're going to reveal weakness. And you're going to give them a chance to feel like they can really help you by talking about the specific problems that you need insight and answers about. This is also going to clarify that you're not a time waster, that you've done your Google research, that you've answered the obvious questions already, and that there's something unique to this person where their particular life experiences and insight and contributions can really help you. Next up, you're going to put them on a pedestal by showing them how much they in particular can help. This sometimes happens automatically as you reveal weakness because it implies how they can help, and other times you need to do it explicitly. And then last up, the 5th step is to, in no uncertain terms, ask them to help you. The shorter version of this is vision, framing, weakness, pedestal, ask. Or it's a mnemonic for VFWPA. I use very few wizards properly ask. Here's what it might sound like before you have a product. "Hey, Pete. I'm trying to make desk and office rentals less of a pain for new businesses." That's the vision. "We're just starting out and we don't have anything to sell, but we want to make sure that we're building something that actually helps." That's the framing. Not selling, just trying to learn. But you need to say more than that because at the moment you could just be a huge time waster. I've only ever come at this problem from the tenant side, and I'm having a really hard time understanding how it all works from the landlord's perspective. This is your weakness. You're revealing that you don't have all the answers, that you need help. You've been renting out desks for a long time. You've got so much expertise, and you could really help me cut through the fog. That's putting them on the pedestal. You're amazing. You can help me so much, you in particular. Do you have any time in the next couple weeks to meet up for a chat? It would take about 15 minutes, and I'm totally happy to come to you. That's the ask, making it explicit. Sometimes the 5 parts will be combined into just 1 or 2 sentences, or they can be in a different order. You don't have to follow this verbatim. For example, when I originally wrote it, the next email that I'm about to read to you, it sounded a little bit too pitchy, and I was worried the recipient would delete it as sales spam. As such, I advanced my admission of weakness, and I tried to reveal weakness as early as possible. That's very disarming to the recipient because salespeople typically don't do this, so it shows that I'm not being salesy. So, "Hey Scott, I run a startup trying to make advertising more playful and ultimately effective." That's the vision. Very short. "We're having a ton of trouble figuring out how all the pieces of the industry fit together and where we best fit into it." That's the weakness. After the first line, he's thinking, oh, it's a sales pitch, but now he's thinking like, wait, what is this? Like, why is this guy telling me he doesn't have all the answers? Then I immediately follow it up. "You know more about this industry than anyone, and you could really save us from making a ton of mistakes." That's the pedestal. "We are funded, we have venture capital, and we have a couple products already, but this is in no way a sales meeting. I have nothing to sell you about this at this point. We're just moving into a new area, and we could really, really use some of your expertise. So that's the framing. Hey, this is a learning thing, not a sales thing. Can you spare a bit of time in the next week to help point us in the right direction over a coffee? That's the explicit ask. People like to help entrepreneurs, but they also hate wasting their time. An email like this tells people that you understand their concerns and that they will be able to actually help you. They want to help. You just have to give them a clear, non-time wasty way to do so. Once the meeting begins, you also have to remember to grab the reins, or it's liable to degrade from there into them drilling you on their idea, then giving you their opinions, which is exactly what you don't want. It forces you into a pitching situation and destroys your learning. To set the meeting framing and agenda, I basically repeat exactly what I said in the email and then immediately drop into the first question. If someone else has made the introduction, I like to use them as the voice of authority about why this is worth doing. For example, hey Tim, thank you so much for taking the time. This is kind of how the meeting would begin. As I mentioned in the email, we're trying to make it easier for universities to spin out student businesses. That's our vision. And we aren't exactly sure how it all works yet. That's the framing and the weakness. Tom, that's my authority, who made the intro. Tom connected us because you have pretty unique insight into what's going on behind the curtain, and you could really help us get pointed in the right direction. That's the pedestal, and then we can kind of chat for there. And then the transition into questioning, I might say something like, I was looking at your spin-out portfolio, and it's really impressive, especially this company. Can I ask you, how did they get from your classroom to where they are now? So what I'm doing here is, instead of allowing the meeting to go silent, where it will often degrade into a pitch, so tell me what you're working on, so show me the product, so what are you guys thinking about? You need to push the conversation in the direction you want, which is to get into all of the mom test rules, specific examples in the past, decision-making, worldview, all that stuff. These conversations are really easy to screw up, so you need to be the one in control. You set the agenda, you keep it on topic, and you propose the next steps. Don't be a jerk about it, but do have a plan for the meeting and be assertive about keeping it there. Once again, you can only pull this off if you've done a bit of preparation. You need to know your 3 big learning goals, you need to have an idea of possible next steps, and you need to know what kind of commitments you're going to ask for if the meeting goes well. That's the sort of stuff that you do with your team each week in preparation for your customer learning. It's worth noting that this is the way I deal with setting up meetings after a warm intro. So the person has already gotten an introduction from someone they trust, and then I immediately follow it up with this sort of VFPWA. Vision, framing, weakness, pedestal, ask. It's a super powerful combination. Cold approaches are a somewhat different beast, and to be honest, I have never found a magic bullet that works perfectly. However, this format works much better than what you're probably already using. To commute or to call. One of the solutions to the time cost of these conversations is to move them onto a web call or a phone call. In most situations, I would avoid doing that because I don't think the added number of conversations is worth the decreased information that you get from each one. There's a lot of subtle signals that come across in a one-on-one conversation, and personally, I tend to lose them if I'm not able to easily see their face and body language. More subtly, calls damage the delicate power dynamic of these conversations. When someone is having a coffee with you, there's the potential to chat as friends. You can small talk, you can banter, you can talk about their life. You can shoot the breeze about the industry for a bit and keep it casual. They're enjoying it. But this is definitely not true on the phone or on a video call. In those cases, people try to squeeze calls in between other activities, and they're spending the whole time wondering how quickly they can finish with business and hang up so they can get on to their next task. People on the phone or on web calls are super annoyed if you just want to chat. So you need to make the whole thing more formal to keep them on the line, which is one of the exact mistakes we're trying to avoid. Phone calls, for this reason, end up sounding more like scripted interviews than like natural conversations because they are. It's a constraint of the medium, but it really damages your ability to get unbiased learning. Plus, nobody becomes friends over the phone, which means you aren't going to get warm intros. Your future meetings are going to be more difficult. And setting up calls feels faster in the short term, but it's only because you can't see all of the long-term time-saving and business-helping benefits of an in-person one-on-one relationship with your customers. That being said, sometimes you've got no choice. If you are serving customers in a completely different country, and if it's not viable for you to go there yourself to start talking to them and getting to know them, then having phone calls with them is certainly better than having nothing. And as Joel did with Buffer, it can work. It's just you're going to lose a lot of the subtlety from the signals. The advisory flip. In terms of mindset, customer conversations can often be very scary. People go into them, they feel like they're on the back foot because they're asking for a favor. Oh, this person's helping me and I have nothing to give them. Oh, it's so awkward. I'm wasting their time. Okay, here's a trick that's going to fix that. Don't go into these discussions looking for customers. It creates a needy vibe and it forfeits your position of power. Instead, mentally tell yourself that what you're doing is you're going in looking for industry and customer advisors. And the ones who are amazing and who can really help you and who really know their stuff, you're going to give them part of your company. What you're doing is trying to find those people helpful, knowledgeable, and excited about your idea. With that mindset switch, you'll understand why you're there. And instead of it being, oh, we're doing customer learning, but I really want to sell to you. And they can kind of read that. They can read the desperation, and it gets weird. Instead of that, it's more like, hey, let me figure out how great you are by asking questions that are difficult and important and deep about the industry and seeing how much you know your stuff. It becomes much more like you're interviewing someone to hire them, and it puts you naturally in the position of power. You don't need to explicitly tell them that you're looking for advisors. In fact, I wouldn't unless you already quite like them and are ready to make them an offer. This is really just about tricking your mind to give you a helpful internal narrative and to mean that your default behavior is in line with what you should be doing, which is not feeling needy or desperate or like you're on the back foot, but rather feeling like you've got something important to learn from this person and you're going to find it out. How many meetings? Every meeting has an opportunity cost. When you're traveling to that meeting, you aren't writing code or generating leads or drinking margaritas. If you're running a sales-driven business, and especially enterprise sales, the opportunity cost of early conversations is basically zero, since many of the people you're learning from are going to turn into your sales leads. So this means you're doubling up on learning and deal flow. In that case, it's probably wise to talk to as many people as you possibly can because they're going to turn into dollars in your pocket later. There's really no downside. If you're talking to consumers, on the other hand, it's not quite the same because you're not going to reach your consumers through a direct sales process. The interviews, the conversations are purely for learning, and then you're going to kind of throw away that group of customers and do your more scalable online marketing, whatever that is. So there's this decision, how many conversations is enough conversations? How much time should I spend on this? There's a few ways to think about it, and it is definitely not just a fixed number of conversations. The user experience community, they say that you should keep talking to people until you feel like you've heard everything before. That means you're at the point of diminishing returns for your learning, and any further conversations aren't going to change your thinking or your product terribly much. So you get to the point of diminishing returns, you build your product or your business to the next stage, then you go back out and you re-engage with the customers, and you're hearing new stuff because the product's in a different place. That's one way to handle it. Works totally fine. Another way to handle it is to think of customer learning not as something you do once, but rather as an ongoing process which takes a certain number of hours per week. And you're going to keep doing that for the entire life of your company. So, for example, you might say, I'm going to spend 4 hours per week as the CEO or as the head of product or as the head of sales or whatever you are. I'm going to spend 4 hours per week talking to customers. Or I'm going to spend 10 hours per week talking to customers, whatever the number is that you're comfortable with. And that could involve going to 2 meetings with your salesperson. Maybe sales isn't your main thing, but you'll tag along for 2 meetings, so that counts as 2 of your hours. And then you'll spend an hour trying to respond to people who have put in a support ticket or reported a bug or had a problem with your software or made a request. And you'll try to spark up an email conversation and then a phone conversation with them to learn more about why they wanted that feature. And that might be an hour. And then maybe for an hour, you'll go to a meetup once per week. And you'll talk to as many people there as you can who are in your customer segment. And you'll use good mom tests and incognito conversations, not to pitch or to tell them about your business, but just to learn as much as you can about them. Boom, there's your 4-hour investment per week in customer learning. You've kind of defined what it is in advance, so you have an easy process. It doesn't take a lot of mental cycles. And it means that the learning is going to be constantly coming in to your product decisions, your strategy decisions for the life of your company, no matter what changes. This stuff isn't about doing thousands of meetings. It's not about delaying your ability to progress with your product and your business. You don't want to slow anything down. When you do customer conversations correctly, they should make you go faster, not slower. Partly because you've made them really efficient by using the rules that we've talked about. You're getting good, high-quality data. You're keeping it casual. You're using incognito conversations. But they should also make you go faster because you're learning important stuff. Remember when I told you that I built the entire analytics dashboard needlessly? That wasted 3 or 4 months of my whole team's time. I could have saved that by asking 1 or 2 good questions. Once you start to have these experiences yourself, you'll see that those few hours per week are the best hours you've ever spent, and they actually let you program faster rather than taking time away from your programming and your product.
Chapter 7. Choosing your customers. They say that startups don't starve, they drown. You never have too few options, too few leads, or too few ideas. You have too many. You get overwhelmed. You do a little bit of everything and get nowhere. When it comes to getting above water and making faster progress, good customer segmentation, really choosing which customer you focus on, is your best friend. Segmentation. When we look at the big successes, they seem to serve the whole world. Google lets anyone find anything. PayPal helps anyone send money anywhere. Evernote backs up everyone's writing. But they didn't start there. If you start too generic, everything gets watered down. Your marketing message is generic. You suffer feature creep. In the early days, Google helped PhD students find obscure bits of code and research. PayPal helped collectors of weird stuff buy and sell Pez dispensers and Beanie Babies more efficiently. Evernote helped moms save and share recipes. When you have a fuzzy sense of who you're serving, you end up talking to multiple customer segments all at once, which leads to confusing signals and 3 main problems. The first is that you get overwhelmed by options and you don't know where to start. The second problem is that you aren't moving forward, but you can never prove yourself wrong because there's always a different type of customer to talk to. The third is that you receive mixed feedback. One type of people loves it, another type of people hates it, and you can't make sense of it because you're not clear on which is which. Babies or bodybuilders? I remember talking to a woman who had developed a very cool powdered condiment. It was sweet, like a cinnamon brown sugar, but had all the nutrition of a multivitamin. In fact, it was an all-natural superfood. You could survive indefinitely by eating nothing but her powder. She said it had countless uses. You could sprinkle it on your breakfast or mix it with a protein shake. Moms could trick their kids into being healthier. Restaurants could leave it on the tables as a healthy alternative to sugar. But despite all these options, she was running in circles getting nowhere. The bodybuilders wanted one thing, the restaurants wanted another, and the moms needed a third. Making one of them happy always disappointed the others. And like any startup, she didn't have the resources to do everything perfectly at the same time. She didn't know where to start. Even simple problems, like which color to use for the label, were impossible to answer. Big brands or mom and pop shops? Back in my first business, I used to be thrilled that my customer segment was advertisers. I was thinking that everyone advertises somehow, and this was very exciting to me because I thought it would be a gigantic market and our fame and fortune were assured. The market was infinite. As a result, I talked to everyone. I talked to mom and pop shops, e-tailers, big brands, creative agencies, small businesses, music labels, and more. Everyone I talked to had different needs, constraints, problems, and desires. This meant everything we tried with our product ended up sort of working. Everything was somewhat promising. Meanwhile, some people were talking about paying us $10,000 a month, while others laughed at the idea of paying $10. Every new feature was moderately popular with someone. But if we tried to cut any of those features, which weren't behaving as well as we wanted, we would get an uproar. It was always somebody's favorite part. In reality, our customer segment was just impossibly broad. We were trying to serve everyone simultaneously, well before we had the progress and the resources and the product maturity to do so. We said yes to every feature request, which made support a nightmare and made our development slow. Every debate over a new feature could be won by claiming, well, those guys would love it. The reverse argument could be made to prevent any feature's removal. The big trouble was that we couldn't prove ourselves right and we couldn't prove ourselves wrong. We could never say that a new idea had really worked or really failed. We were paying attention to so many different customer segments that there was pretty much always someone it worked for. But making a so-so project for everyone isn't quite the same as making an incredible product for someone. Getting specific about your ideal customer allows you to filter out all the noise which comes from everyone else. It helps you make sense of the feedback and the learning that you're getting. In our case, we eventually noticed unusually strong signals from creative agencies who wanted to be edgy. We ignored everyone else, cut a bunch of features, and were finally able to get a sense of what was working and what wasn't. But what does it mean? I recently spoke to a couple of founders who had been working really hard on their customer conversations. They were using every single sales meeting as an opportunity to learn, which is great. They were asking good questions, which passed the mom test, and they were pushing for advancement and commitment whenever it was relevant. And yet, they were still super confused and weren't sure how to move the business to the next level. They couldn't decide which features to build and which to cut. They didn't know how to improve their marketing language. To make matters worse, the feedback they were getting was wildly inconsistent. If they had 20 conversations, they ended up with 20 different must-have features and 20 must-solve problems. The more people they talked to, the more confused they got. What was going on here? Their customer segment was incredibly broad, but in a sneaky way. Imagine that we're building something for students. I've got a picture of an American undergraduate in my head, but maybe you've got a picture of a British graduate student. Our third co-founder pictures a high schooler or someone in the developing world, but in any case, we managed to agree on features and start building something. Once we launch, the feedback starts coming in. But one user needs formal citations, another wants practice questions. A third needs iPad support. A fourth needs a bunch of collaborators who all share the same computer. Someone else needs to be able to use the app even though the internet is shaky. We're looking at this list of requirements and our soul feels like it's being forced through a spaghetti strainer. This will literally take years to build, and where do we start? Well, it turns out the students isn't a customer segment at all. It's a collection of a ton of customer students. There's the PhD student, there's the ambitious youngling at a prep school, there's the homeschooling parent who wants to use it with their kid, there's someone in a rural village, there's someone who's trying to learn off of a cell phone connection. All of these are students. The confused founders we met at the beginning of this section were having the same experience, but for sales organizations. There are countless kinds of sales organizations with fundamentally different needs, workflows, tools, and goals. From the outside, they all look like companies who are trying to do sales, but on the inside, they're very, very different. Even if you narrow it down with a demographic constraint, saying sales organizations for 25 to 250 salespeople, you're still facing an impossible amount of variation. The founders weren't having 20 conversations with their customers. They were having one conversation each with 20 different types of customers. That's an important difference, and you might be making the same mistake, and that's why the feedback they were getting was so inconsistent. In these cases, an industry expert can be hugely helpful in providing a taxonomy of the industry. It'll give you a better starting point for choosing where to begin. If you don't have access to that kind of high-level view, you still want to take your best guess and get specific. The next section, on customer slicing, is one way to approach it, although there are plenty of others. Over time, your understanding of the industry will improve, and you can adjust your mental categories as needed. When your customer feedback is all over the map, you can extract value. Once you're able to get specific and find one type of person, you're able to start learning. Rule of thumb. If you aren't finding consistent problems and goals, you probably don't yet have a specific enough customer segment. Customer slicing. If you're facing a generic set of customer segments, you can use customer slicing to pick a concrete starting point. Start with your segment, students, whoever, and then keep slicing off better and better subsets of it until you've got a tangible sense of who you can go talk to and where you can physically find them, either in the real world or online. So start with a broad segment and ask yourself, within this group of all the different types of people inside the group, which specific type of person would want it most? Would everyone within this group buy it and use it, or only a subset of this group? Why does that subset want it? What's their specific problem that's really driving them? Does everyone in the group have the motivation, or only some of them? Are there other motivations and other reasons why different types of people in the group might want it? Are there other types of people who aren't in the group I was thinking about that share the motivations? I know that sounds very abstract, but hopefully you get the gist. Within a big group of students, which are the students that want it most? What makes them special? Are there other people like them elsewhere outside the group of students? Sometimes we get stuck in demographic definitions when, once you start thinking of goals and problems and worldviews, you can jump outside the demographics and find a unifying thread
that pulls together a bunch of different types of people who seem dissimilar on the outside, but are actually held together by why they want your product. As a quick example, let's say that I'm building some sort of high-end fitness gadget for busy professionals. It's going to be expensive, so I figure they have to be high income, maybe finance professionals. And it's going to be digital, so I'm imagining they're going to be young, say 25 to 35. And finance professionals tend to live in big cities, so we'll tack that on. My customer segment right now, as a starting point, and I'll expand out from here, this isn't the limitation of my market by any means, but it's somewhere to get my first few conversations, would be finance professionals aged 25 to 35 living in a major city. How does that sound? Well, I don't like it. This feels totally worthless because it doesn't help me make better decisions and it doesn't really help me find them. What I want to do is slice it down further. Finance professionals of a certain age in a big city, there's a lot of different types of people inside that group. So I want to keep slicing until I find the subgroup who wants it most, and then I can get somewhere. For example, finance professionals in London currently training for a marathon. I'm related to health, and if they're currently training for a marathon, that identifies them and shows them that they really care. This is better. We know this slice is taking fitness seriously, so we can suspect they're going to be stronger early adopters. We can slice that even further by saying that it's the group who goes to the gym during their lunch hour. Now we can have the customer conversations we desire by just buying a gym membership at a gym in the financial district and hanging out there during the lunch hour and sparking up chats with people. That's obviously a bit of a sneaky conversation, and you would want to handle it delicately and respectfully so as not to make people feel weird, but it points toward the core concept, which is that the more thin-sliced you can make your customer segment definition, at least to start with, the easier they are to find. If there isn't a clear physical or digital location at which you can find your customer segment, then it's probably still too broad to start with. Go back up the list and slice it into finer pieces until you know where to find them. A customer segment isn't very useful if there's no way you can get in touch. Once you have a bunch of who-where pairs, you can decide who you want to start with based on who seems the most profitable, easiest to reach, or the most personally rewarding. Don't plan and theorize forever about this stuff. Just spend a few minutes to reach a concrete initial segment so that you can go find a couple of them and move the business forward. As mentioned, you'll broaden the customer segment later. But your learning will go much faster and be much useful at the beginning if you can choose a group that's incredibly specific and that also meets the 3 big criteria of being reachable, profitable, and personally rewarding. On a personal note, I find that the third factor is really important. It's worth choosing customers who you admire and like and enjoy being around. It's hard work to talk to people and to understand their lives and understand their problems, and you're going to spend a lot of time in contact with your potential customers and your actual customers. It's a real grind if you're cynical about them and their goals and their lives. And it's a real joy if you're trying to serve people who you actually like. Rule of thumb. Good customer segments at the beginning are a who-where pair. If you don't know where to find your customers, keep slicing the segment into smaller pieces until you do. Talking to the wrong people. You can't get the data you need if you're talking to the wrong people. There are 3 ways falling into this clearly unhelpful trap. The first is that you have too broad of a segment and are talking to everyone. The second is that you have multiple customer segments and you've missed some of them. The third is that you're selling to businesses with a complicated buying process and you've overlooked some of their stakeholders. We've already talked about number 1, having too broad of a segment. If you talk to everyone, many of the people you talk to are going to be irrelevant or just confuse you. Regarding the second or third, it can really throw a wrench into your plans if you're building a product which depends on the sign-off of someone, whether they're a customer segment or just an individual within a complex organization, and you completely overlook them. This will trip you up later. They'll torpedo the deal. Your business won't work. The partner you were going to depend on isn't going to be there for you. So you need to know about them. Sometimes it can happen with multi-sided marketplaces or if the buyer is different from the user. For example, if you were building an app for kids, you would need to understand what both the kids and the parents care about. If you're building something for public schools, you would need to understand the teachers, the students, the administrators, and potentially even the parent-teacher association or the taxpayers or the government, depending on how it's funded. In those cases, you essentially run your customer learning process multiple times so that you can get all sides of the marketplace, all stakeholders, all decision makers. Be careful about the trap of only talking to the most senior and important people you can find. If you only talk to the CEO, you still might get tripped up when the actual workers on the factory floor refuse to use or don't like the product that you've built for them, even if the CEO likes it in theory and has signed off on it. You need everyone in the value chain to want it, and you need to understand their issues as well as you do with the economic buyer. There's a related issue where you have a spread of customer segments, and some of them are much bigger and more profitable than others. So let's say you work with individuals, you sell to freelancers, and you sell to small businesses, and you sell to mid-sized businesses. It's really tempting during your learning to focus on the important and profitable groups. It looks good in your sales pipeline and in your calendar if you're meeting with a big company that everyone knows about. But if your business depends on revenue from individuals and from small and unknown companies, then you want to make sure you spend a large portion of your learning time on them. Yes, it's not going to be a profitable meeting, but it's measured in terms of learning, not in terms of money. And that learning then translates out to all of the other customers who are buying your product online without you having to talk to them. A common question is whether you need to run customer conversations separately for multi-sided marketplaces, and the sad answer is yes. So, to wrap that up, if you're having trouble finding people to talk to, you probably need to get more specific. And similarly, if you're getting a lot of conflicting and confusing feedback from your customers, it probably means you're actually talking to several different customer segments, and you haven't properly split them apart yet. If this is the case, you certainly don't need to beat yourself up. Customer segmentation is very non-obvious until you've gotten yourself inside an industry and you're starting to really understand people's worldviews, goals, etc. And sometimes the only way you can discover who your customer segment is to start to talk to people. Then you find the ones who are really excited, and you spend more time talking to people like that and less time talking to the people who are less excited. Chapter 8. Running the Process. Even if you do everything else right, you can get bad results if you don't have the right process wrapped around your conversations. Showing up and hoping for the best is not making a good use of anyone's time. You need to do a little bit of work before and after the meeting to extract full value. A common anti-pattern is for the business guy, the salesperson on the founding team, to go to all the meetings and to subsequently tell the rest of the team what everyone should do. This is a bad idea. In this case, telling the rest of the team what I learned from the customers is functionally equivalent to telling them what you will do because I command it. In this way, owning the customer conversations creates a de facto dictator with the customer said so as the ultimate trump card. And that's a problem because, as we've seen, it's really easy to misinterpret what a customer has said, to draw the wrong conclusions, or to base your decisions off of bad data. When all of the customer learning is stuck inside someone's head instead of being disseminated to the rest of the team, you've got a learning bottleneck. Avoid creating or being the learning bottleneck. To do that, the learning needs to be shared with the entire founding team, and ideally the entire team that's making any sort of product or strategy or sales or marketing decisions. And to share it with these people, it depends on taking good notes, plus a bit of work before and after the meeting. The most extreme way to bottleneck is to go to meetings alone, take bad notes, and then fail to review those notes with your team. At that point, your head has just become the ultimate repository of customer truth, and everyone basically has to do what you say. In my case, I once bottlenecked so hard that my CTO quit while saying, "We're never going to succeed if you keep changing what we're doing." In my defense, all of the decisions I was making were based on real customer learning, or at least I thought they were, on my best understanding of the customer conversations I was having. But it didn't matter since I hadn't properly communicated that to the rest of the team, so I ended up losing a key tech person. These sorts of bottlenecks can be created from either end. The founder in touch with customers can do a bad job of sharing it, or the rest of the team can refuse to engage with customers and not respect or spend the time on the learnings. So we want to fix both. Some symptoms of a learning bottleneck could include someone on the team saying, "You just worry about the product, I'll handle the customers," or "We're doing it because the customers told me so," or a tech person or a product person saying, "I don't have time to talk to people, I need to be coding." Avoiding bottlenecks has three parts: preparing, reviewing, and taking good notes. Preparing. Your most important preparation is to ensure you know your current big three questions. I've mentioned it a bunch of times because it's important. Spend the time to sit down with your team and figure them out. And this is not as obvious as it first appears, because the questions you're trying to answer are deeply rooted into your analysis of your own business strategy and risks. What's scariest? What do you depend on? What is your future product decisions hinging on? It's a really interesting strategy and introspective discussion to figure out what these learning goals should be. If you've already learned the facts about your customers in your industry, you understand them pretty well, then you can kind of go ahead and plan which commitments and next steps you're going to ask for at the end of a good meeting. It's easier to guide your customer conversations and stay on track if you have an existing set of beliefs that you're updating, as opposed to if you are starting with no ideas whatsoever about what the customer might care about. To get to this initial state, if you're brand new in an industry, spend a while writing down your best guesses about what the people you're about to talk to care about. You'll probably be wrong, but it's easier to keep this discussion going and to stay on the important points if you've at least created a skeleton and have a thesis. If you have an appropriately focused customer segment, then this won't happen terribly often because the learning you're getting from one conversation will apply fairly directly to the next one. While preparing, if you come across a question which could be answered with desk research by Googling it, then take a moment to just do that. You want to move past the obvious stuff so that you can use your in-person conversations to find the deep insights that the internet can't give you. You want to use your conversation time to figure out why they're doing something. You don't need demographic info. Similarly, if you're about to meet with a business, do your basic due diligence on LinkedIn and the company website. It only takes 5 minutes, and it'll make sure that you don't trash the conversation and leave looking like an idiot when you ask something that was pretty obvious from their website. Sit down with your whole founding team when you prep. You want both business and product to be represented. If you leave part of the company out of the prep, then you end up missing their concerns in the customer conversations. Some founders react with hostility to this whole idea. They'll say something along the lines of, "We just need to focus on the darn product. We need to stop wasting our time talking to people. They're all going to lie to us anyway." This is a reasonable reaction if they feel like there's no good data available from customer conversations. And that could actually be the case if historically the customer conversations have been done incorrectly. So part of this is showing them that you're changing the way you're running your customer conversations, which will lead to better value. You're going to ask better questions, you're going to avoid the biases, you're going to collect concrete commitments, you're going to take good notes. That should go a long way to at least getting them to be willing to give it a second try. However, you still need to involve them a bit more than that. The minimum involvement is to ask your skeptical or grumpy team members to humor you and to help you pick the learning goals. And then to occasionally, once you've got them rolling and have found some friendly customers, to join you as a spectator at one or two of these conversations. You never want to bring lots of people to a meeting, but bringing 2 people is totally appropriate. One of you can focus on asking the questions, probably you, and the other, probably your skeptical co-founder, can focus on taking notes. You might also decide that the note taker can jump in at key points if they feel like you're going off track, to help kind of coach you and correct you if you start to ask bad questions. It doesn't take a lot of time before the product people, and I am a product person, I'm a programmer, so I've experienced this for myself. It doesn't take long before they see the value when they're sitting in on a good conversation. Suddenly their eyes light up and they're thinking, wow, this answers that question we've been arguing about in every board meeting for months. Or, oh my gosh, we don't need to build that feature that was going to take us a month. And once they've seen the value firsthand, they suddenly become an evangelist of the process instead of being a critic of it. The prep conversations are not a long, involved thing. Your gut reaction is probably enough to what your learning goals should be. A little bit of prep goes a long way. Don't bog down the team by spending hours and hours on it, but you do need to do a little bit of it, and you need to return to it fairly regularly whenever your learning changes. I always liked a weekly tempo, but if that's too much for your team, then so be it. The one critical question you have to answer before a group of important conversations is, what do we really want to learn from these people? Rule of thumb, if you don't know what you're trying to learn, you shouldn't bother having conversations. Reviewing after a meeting. After a conversation, you want to review your notes with the team and update your own beliefs, and then update your 3 big questions as you need to. The goal of the note review is to move the raw data out of your head and into your entire team's head. So what you're not doing is telling them your conclusion. You are not saying, hey, I just had a bunch of meetings with these potential customers and they all love it or they all think we should do it this way. That's telling your team the conclusion. What you want to do is walk them through the actual words that were spoken. Not the entire meeting transcript, because that's a bit tedious, but the important quotes, the important excerpts. Say, they got really emotional here and they said, I would do anything to never use Excel again. It is the worst part of my existence. That's a great quote and it's tagged up with an emotion. They hate it. And then they said, but our IT guys won't let us use any cloud apps. It drives me crazy. Oh, well, that's interesting too. That's a great quote. That's an obstacle. It shows why they haven't adopted one of the competitors' products already. So by walking through these key moments in the conversation with the rest of your team, it's as if everyone was there with you. And then you can all talk together about what this means. You can draw your conclusions from it. I like to do this once per week in a meeting where everyone on the team who has had customer contact walks through all of the important quotes and things that they learned, shares the raw data with the rest of the team. Then we essentially throw away the notes. Some people advise doing audio recordings of every conversation or doing full transcripts and emailing them around or saving them in the Dropbox. I have found that does not work because it takes too long to review. Realistically, no one is going to listen to an audio recording of the meeting. The meeting was probably boring enough the first time. You certainly don't want to listen to it a second time. And if you're not going to listen to it, then the recording doesn't matter. So I like the excerpts of key quotes tagged up with emotions. For me, that's the best balance of accuracy of the raw data and also being time efficient for everyone else. And I like batching them into the weekly meetings so that we're not constantly interrupting each other each time we finish talking to a customer. Who should show up? Everyone on the team who's making big decisions, including the tech decisions, should be involved in at least some of the customer conversations. The tech folks don't need to learn how to lead them if they don't want to. I personally did, and I'm really glad I did. But you don't have to. You just have to occasionally go and spectate so that you're not completely buffered from what the customers care about. Meetings go best when you've got 2 people or 1 person at them. 2 is ideal. 1 takes notes, as mentioned, while the other talks. If you send more than 2 people, it starts to feel like a focus group or a gang, and the customer gets a little bit intimidated with the audience, so they'll tend to put their shields up and you won't get as honest of a conversation out of them. If you're shy and if you don't have a co-founder, what you can do is call in a favor with a friend who is more capable or comfortable in this situation and ask the friend to take the lead. Do a little bit of prep with them. Maybe you return the favor some way by helping them with their product, for example, or you both go to each other's meetings, however you want to work it. You play the more passive role of the note taker until you're comfortable. As you get comfortable, start chiming in with the occasional question, and your friend kind of knows that they're going to back down as you step up until you're comfortable taking the lead. This is like a peer-to-peer version of sales coaching, and it works really well. You can prep together, you can help each other out. If you're a student, a freelancer, a solo entrepreneur, I'd really recommend it. You can't outsource or hire someone to do the customer learning for you. Maybe it works occasionally if you have the world's most incredible consultant who you completely trust, but in general, it almost always fails. When a hired gun brings you bad news, they come in and they say, hey, I talked to a bunch of customers. It turns out no one cares at all and your entire business is doomed and you should probably shutter it and go home. Properly assimilating that feedback is really difficult. And as an entrepreneur, it would almost be irresponsible to believe them. You can't just shut down your business based on what some random consultant says. But also, can you keep going in the face of that? You kind of then need to go back out and do all of the learning yourself just to prove it. So why not do it yourself to begin with? Consultants are used for kind of checkbox customer learning when you want to prove to someone that you did a process, but you actually don't care about what you're hearing. So if the learning matters, you want to do it yourself. If it feels like too much of a time cost, just refer to this book. Try to bring down the time cost, make it more casual, and bring up the quality of information by focusing on important questions and good data. How to write it down. Taking good notes is the best way to keep your team and your investors and your advisors in the loop about what you're learning from customers. Plus, notes make it harder to lie to yourself. And when, months later, you decide to adjust the business's direction, you can return to your notes instead of having to do a whole new set of customer interviews. When possible, as mentioned, you want to write down exact quotes. I wrap my quotes in question marks so I know it's verbatim. I also use summaries if I need to. It's kind of a business shorthand. You leave out all the unimportant stuff and you just grab the most crucial few words and you throw an emotion on there, a smiley face, a frowny face, so that you can remember the context. After the meeting, you can transfer it into a more permanent storage system if you'd like. You kind of go through and filter your notebook along with who you were talking to and what the date was, or you can just talk to your team, walk them through what you wrote down, and then discard it. That's up to you. The full set of symbols I use, and I acknowledge that this is slightly silly to talk through on an audiobook when they are visual symbols, but I'll describe them anyway. I like to track a few different things. I like to track symbols about their emotional state, any background information they give me about their life, and specific pieces of data and follow-up tasks. So for each of these, I use an emoticon, and so I'm writing a few words in my notes plus an emoticon, and combined, it lets me rebuild a conversation very accurately with very little writing, which lets me keep up with a conversation, even if I'm by myself. So the emotions are things like excited, angry, embarrassed is an interesting one. For example, in industries like sustainability and security, customers know they ought to be doing a better job, but they're not, and they're embarrassed about that. And digging into their embarrassment can give you all sorts of interesting signals about why they haven't solved the problem already and why they might not adopt your product. Some of the symbols about their life, if they mention a pain, a problem, a frustration, I use a little lightning bolt. If they mention what they're trying to achieve, their goal or their job to be done, I draw a football goal. If it's an obstacle, I draw a box. A workaround is a bendy arrow. Our obstacle is that my goal is that I would love to be able to share documents more easily, but the obstacle is that the IT team won't let us because they want to virus check and security check everything. And so my workaround is that I bring in my personal iPad and I use that for my file sharing at work. If someone gives me background information about their industry, their business, I draw a little upward pointing arrow as a mountain. It's the background of a photo. And these symbols are the bread and butter of my information about my customers. Their pains, their goals, their obstacles, workarounds, and background information. Sometimes people throw emotions in here as well. Like maybe they get real upset about the IT restrictions. Maybe they're frustrated. Some of the follow-up specifics, I use a little checkbox if someone gives me a particular feature request or a purchasing criteria. As I draw that symbol, I'm also reminding myself, feature request, I need to dig underneath this. Why do they want it? How often would they use it? I need to ask some good follow-up questions about that. If they mention any financial figure, you can bet I'm going to write that down exactly, along with a $sign, or, your choice of currency. This also could be information about their purchasing process. If they casually mention, of course you'd need to talk to our lawyers and go through procurement. Boom, I'm writing that down. That's super important, and I'm going to ask some more questions. Who else would I need to talk about? What's the timeline on that sort of thing? Where would we need to get to in this deal for you to be comfortable introducing me to them? If someone mentions a specific person, Johnny would be pretty interested in this. I'm going to write down Johnny and I draw a little person icon. At the end of the meeting, I'm going to scan through my notes before I leave, and I'm going to remind them about each person. You said Johnny might be relevant. When do you think would be the right time for us to get in touch with him? How does that work? This might be a great transition into asking for a reputational commitment in the form of an intro. And for my own self, if there's a follow-up task, obviously just mark it with a star. Often you'll promise to send someone some more info or to help them out in some way. And in order to return the favor for this wonderful learning conversation that they've given you, you want to make sure that you make good on any promises to them. Where to write it down? So I've already explained why I don't like using audio recording. Even though customers are surprisingly happy to be recorded, it's because no one will listen to the recordings on your team. So you need to write it down in a way that's quick and easy to access. That's the most important criteria. But there are some other practicalities and benefits. It's nice if you put the notes somewhere that they can be sorted, mixed, and rearranged. For example, if you can look through your notes and pull out all of the problems that your customers have mentioned, or all of the goals, or all of the blockers. One way to do this is to use cards, like very small index cards, and to write one customer quote along with a symbol on each card. I used this for years, and I love it. I had a giant shoebox full of all of my customer interviews for each project. And you can lay the notes out on the table and kind of workshop them with your team in this way. The downside is, it's a bit weird and tedious and you need supplies. So something else you can do to get the same result is after your meetings, you transfer your notes into a spreadsheet where you've got one column for who it was and the date, another column for the symbols, the emotion symbols, or to show you what kind of background information it is, as we just talked about, and then another column for the actual quote. This is obviously then easily sortable by problems or goals or obstacles or by a particular customer conversation. If you do end up taking your notes in non-ideal places, I was once at a picnic where I found an incredible customer, so I took all my notes on the back of paper plates. You just need to take the extra time afterwards to transfer them. If you're keeping it casual and doing incognito conversations where people don't even know that you're talking to them about anything, then what you can do is you talk for a few minutes and then immediately afterwards, excuse yourself, go to a corner and jot down as best you can remember it. This isn't ideal, but it's much better than nothing, and it works well enough. So, what about taking notes on a laptop? Does that work? Well, kind of, but you need to do it in a very specific way, because putting a computer between yourself and your customer and glancing up and down between the two sends a very bad signal to the customer. It shows that you're a bit distracted, you're not getting a good connection, and it functions kind of like being on the phone. It has all the same problems where it makes the conversation feel businessy, everyone's in a hurry to get it over with, you're not building that personal connection. So if you're going to use a computer, you have to be a perfect touch typist so that you never need to look at the screen. And what you're going to do is set the computer not in front of you, between you and the customer, but set it off to the side at a 45-degree angle where it's not in the between you on the line. It's out of the way, your shoulders are twisted, you're typing off to the side, and you're able to maintain perfect eye contact with whoever you're talking to. It still comes across as a bit weird, but if it's the only way that you can reasonably take notes, then fine. Just when you start doing it, kind of tell the customer what's happening, explain what you're doing and why you're doing it, and ask their permission. Hey, I'm a super slow writer, and what you're saying is really important to me. Is it cool if I take some notes on my computer while we're talking? I'm, still super focused on what you're saying. And they say, oh yeah, I get it, that's fine. You can do that, but try to avoid ever looking down at your computer. You gotta trust in your touch typing skills to make that work properly. Rule of thumb: notes are useless if you don't look at them and if you don't share them with your team. The process. Talking to customers is a tool, not an obligation. If it's not going to be helpful, or if there's some reason that you legitimately don't think you should do it, then just skip it. I'm sure you've been on the receiving end of a half-assed survey sent out by some new startup who just wants to tick the box that they've tried to learn from customers. But there are better ways to waste your time, and certainly better uses of your customers' time. You gotta start all your customer learning by figuring out what actually matters to your company. If you're not doing that, then you're just going through the motions and you may as well not bother. So here are some more warning signs that you're just going through the motions instead of actually learning. You're talking more than your customer is. They're complimenting you or your idea and you're accepting it. You've told them about your idea, you've shown them the product, but you don't have clear next steps or a commitment. You've gone to a meeting and you don't have notes. You have notes, but you haven't looked through them or shared them with your team. You were talking to a customer and heard something that surprised you. It was an unexpected answer, but it didn't actually influence your idea at all. You went through a whole meeting and felt good about all of it, and you didn't ask a single question that was scary or with an answer that would actually threaten what you were doing. Or you're having a conversation, but you aren't actually sure what you're trying to learn or why it matters. The persistent presence of any of those problems would suggest that you're doing something wrong and wasting everybody's time. So here are the steps I go through to keep on track. Feel free to ignore or tweak this as needed, because obviously processes are very company specific and you're going to want to make it your own. But this is as lightweight as I've been able to get it, and hopefully it will reduce rather than increase the amount of time that you need to spend on conversations. So before a batch of conversations, these are the things I do. If I haven't yet, I choose a focused, findable customer segment by slicing it as thin as I can. Within my team, I sit down and we talk about what really matters, what are our big learning goals for this week, for right now. If we're far enough along, we decide on the next steps and commitments that I would ask for a customer if the conversation has gone really well and it seems like they're keen. So for the things we're trying to learn, if we can learn them through conversations, I would then figure out who I can talk to or where I can go, where my customers will also be so that I can surprise people. And if any of the questions could be answered more quickly in another way, with a desk research, with an MVP, with a call to an industry expert, then I'm going to do that first so I don't waste my time setting up a customer meeting for it. During the conversation itself, I'm going to frame the conversation so that they know it's not about sales. I'm going to use very few wizards properly ask, vision, framing, weakness, pedestal, ask, so that they know it's about learning and that they can really help me. Throughout the conversation, as much as possible, I'm going to keep it casual. We don't need formality. This isn't a big interview. It's not a focus group. I'm just trying to talk to you about your life. I'm going to ask good questions which pass the mom test. Not every question is perfect, and that's okay. But I'm going to try to always bring it back. I'm going to deflect the compliments. I'm going to anchor the fluff. I'm going to dig beneath your signals. When you get emotional about anything, I'm going to ask you more. Oh, why is that so exciting? Oh, why does that upset you so much? Wow, this seems like a big deal. Dig beneath the signals. I'm going to take good notes. And if relevant, if you seem happy, I'm going to give you the chance to accept or reject some kind of commitment, some kind of next step. I'm not being pushy. I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just trying to figure out, hey, are you really a customer? Or are you just an excited person who's being nice to me? After my conversations, usually at the end of the week, with my team, we're all going to sit down together. We're going to go through the notes and the key customer quotes. If it's relevant, I'm also going to transfer my notes into permanent storage somewhere. As a team, if the customer said anything crazy, or we're starting to hear a lot that we're chasing the wrong direction, we're going to update our beliefs and maybe even modify our plan, change our business model even, tweak our product. And in any case, now that we've answered some of our questions, we're going to have a new set of questions, so we're going to plan our questions for next week. This process doesn't take a lot of time. At maximum, it's a meeting on Monday and a meeting on Friday, a preparation meeting and a review meeting. In many cases, you could do the whole thing in one meeting in a single hour. So it's not like a massive overhead to what you're already doing. The goal is twofold. Firstly, to ensure that you're spending your time well by attacking the questions which really matter and making use of the brains of the entire team and not just your own brain. The second goal is to spread any learning you get throughout your entire team as quickly and completely as possible. So it's not just you making all the decisions, but rather it's you making the whole team smarter so that you guys can then make your decisions together. There you go. Now you know everything I know about how to learn from customer conversations. Use this process with the mom test, keep it casual, and make sure you push for advancement, and that'll all help you get maximum learning in minimum time. But even if it goes wrong, don't worry so much. This stuff is a hands-on skill, and you've got to forgive yourself and give yourself the chance to make mistakes to learn how to get better at it. If you were trying to learn how to skateboard, you wouldn't pick up a board for the first time and go straight down a half pipe or something, right? And if you fell over, even when you were trying something simple, you wouldn't write off skateboarding forever. You would recognize that it's something you need to practice and get better at, and you're going to take your falls. And running proper customer conversations is the same way. You're going to make mistakes. It's cool. Try to do your best, but don't beat yourself up when it goes wrong. There are a lot of customers in the world. Even if you completely burn a couple bridges, it's not the end of the world. You're going to learn from it. You're going to do better. And those benefits are going to compound and really move your business forward. It's a great career skill. This is useful for salespeople, but it's also incredibly useful for tech people. You're going to enjoy the benefits of learning this skill for the rest of your career. This stuff is fast. The timescales of the process are important. The point is to make your business move faster, not slower. It doesn't make sense to spend an entire week prepping for one meeting. Rather, you want to spend an hour and then go talk to some people. If you're spending a lot more time than that on prep, you're probably just stalling. You also don't want to spend months doing nothing but customer conversations. Customer conversations and building your product should happen in parallel. The customer conversations help you figure out what you should be building and what's a dead end, and then as you build a little bit more, it opens up the next stage of customer conversations. You can learn more, you've got something to show them, you've got better understanding about what you're doing because of what you've built. When you're doing it right, customer learning can feel like a whirlwind. You're like, man, I talked to so many people this week and I learned so much and that was so fun and I have so many more leads and it's very exciting and motivating and thrilling. It's not an excuse for you to stop building your company. Some people get addicted to the theory. They get addicted to the idea of 100% removing all risk whatsoever, but that never happens. Risk is a spectrum. You know, it's crazy to build your company and launch your company with zero customer evidence, because then you're just gambling. You're blindfolding yourself and jumping off a cliff. But you're also never going to get to 100% certainty. You know, reality and what a market wants, it's a moving target. It changes over time. It's going to change while you're building your business. So you get to good enough. You talk to some people. You feel like it's good enough, but then you still need to take your scary entrepreneurial leap. So as mentioned, I want you to think of customer conversations as a tool, not an obligation. This isn't something that's meant to slow you down. It's a weapon you use when appropriate to unlock massive learning for your business. It should speed you up. It should make you faster. It should be fun. It should be casual. It should be easy. The biggest mistake people make, apart from the obvious stuff about asking bad questions and getting massively biased data, you know, Mom Test 101, but when they're actually trying to do the process and they're trying to do it properly, the biggest mistake they make is to be way too formal with everything. They try to set up formal meetings. They try to have formal interviews. They try to ask formal questions. Formality introduces biases, and formality also has an enormous time cost. So start looking for these opportunities to keep it casual, the incognito conversations, the taking advantage of serendipity. Once you get into the habit of looking for those opportunities, that's where you see the enormous time gains, and that's where it feels like customer learning is just falling into your lap for free instead of you having to really go and spend a lot of time gathering it. Rule of thumb, go build your dang company already. You're going to do great. Conclusion and cheat sheet. So I want to wrap with a story from ancient times, which may or may not be true. But in any case, it had been prophesized that whoever undid the convoluted Gordian knot, it was this impossibly knotted together, gigantic, thick, heavy rope that was pulled across a crucial piece of the desert. And whoever untied it, it was foreseen, would rule the land. And a lot of people had tried, and no one got anywhere. If anything, their efforts only made the knot more knotted and more difficult. And when he reached it with his armies, Alexander the Great, who wasn't the Great at the time, he was just Alexander, he drew his sword, and with a single stroke, he cut it in half. The knot was undone, and, he went on to rule everything. Struggling to untie the knot was the proper process. That was, as the textbooks would say, the textbook about Gordian knot untying would tell you to study it and be patient and, start at one end. But cutting through it was a hack, which got Alexander straight to the end result without any of the work. When we find a new and exciting process, like talking to customers, it's easy to do the opposite of what Alexander did, and to spend hours and weeks and months obsessively geeking out about exactly the right way to untie this big gnarly knot. I remember being in a startup workshop, and one of the guys there, he was a personal trainer. So really not a startup, but certainly an entrepreneur, and he was trying to make his personal training business bigger. He said he was spending most of his time on non-billable commuting time. He had to travel between his clients, so for 1 hour of paid work, he would have to do an hour and a half of traveling. At some point, it was suggested to him that the police might be a better customer segment. Instead of commuting between a bunch of individuals' houses, he could go to one police station and work with all of their officers doing the custom training that he was so great at. No commute, more billable hours, and presumably they would pay him better. It sounded really good in theory. Everyone in the class, we started geeking out on all of his possibilities, about how he was going to validate it. Who could he talk to? Did anyone have family in the police? What should his interview questions be? What was the market size? How many police precincts were in the city? Etc., etc. We were theorizing business models and websites and all this stuff. And he looked at us like we were all idiots, and he held up his phone. And he goes, "Guys, slow down. I think I'll just call them." It's not like he didn't know the phone number for the police. We all stood around a bit dumbfounded, and he went outside and called the police. 20 minutes later, he came back in with a trial session scheduled. Having a process and having the tools is valuable, but don't get trapped by it. Sometimes you can just pick up the phone and hack through the knot. Cheat sheet. Just in case you like lists, I will rattle through some lists of where stuff is. So the key skills that you need to get good at in order for this to work: asking good questions, which we covered in chapters 1 and 3, avoiding bad data, which is chapter 2, keeping it casual, chapter 4, pushing for commitments and advancements, chapter 5, framing the meeting, very few wizards properly ask, chapter 6, customer segmentation, chapter 7, prepping and reviewing before and after your meetings, taking good notes, chapter 8. The MOM test itself has 3 rules. Talk about their life instead of your idea. Don't pitch your idea if you can. Ask about specifics in the past instead of generics or hypotheticals or opinions about the future. Dig beneath signals. When someone gives you an emotional signal or a frustration or a joy, dig beneath it. And kind of the extra bonus rule is, as much as possible, shut up. Talk less, listen more. To avoid bad data, deflect compliments, anchor fluff, and dig beneath signals. Some of the mistakes that you might make, these are symptoms, and if you see yourself making them or saying these things, you know that you're in trouble. But that's good news, because then you can fix it. So the first one's fishing for compliments. You get this by saying stuff like, "Hey, I'm thinking of starting a business, so what do you think?" Or, "I had an awesome idea. Do you like it?" Another mistake is exposing your ego, or the pathos problem. "So, here's that top secret project I quit my job for. What do you think? I can take it. Be honest. Tell me whether it's good or not." Another mistake is anytime you're being pitchy. No, I don't think you get it." "Yeah, fine. So you don't like it, but it also does this." Fourth mistake is being too formal. Making it a formal interview, a formal whatever. "So first off, thank you for agreeing to this interview. I just have a few questions. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much would you..." Or often a lot of the times when you're just trying to set up a meeting, that's a sign that you're being a bit too formal when you could have just chatted to them right then. Fifth mistake is being a learning bottleneck. You don't have to worry about the product. I'll talk to all the customers. You just focus on the tech. Or "we have to do this because the customers told me," or whenever you're not sharing your notes. Another mistake is collecting compliments instead of facts and commitments. "Hey, we're getting a lot of positive feedback," or "everyone I've talked to loves it." Also, you should remember that meetings are either good or bad. A bad meeting ends with a compliment plus a stalling tactic, and you're a bit unclear on what the next steps are, and they haven't given you anything of value. Whereas a good meeting gives you facts, commitments, and advancement. Facts are concrete, specific details about what the customer does and why they do it that way. This is in comparison to the bad data, compliments, opinions, fluff. Commitments are a sign that the customer is showing they're serious, and they do this by giving you something they value, such as meaningful amounts of time, reputation, or money. Advancement means they're moving to the next step of your real-world funnel. They're getting closer to a trial, a sale, a proof of concept. They're moving forward in a meaningful way. There's also a fourth thing you can get, specifically with enterprises, where they're basically giving you insight into their buying process. They're showing you behind the scenes about how their organization works, what their budgets are, who the stakeholders are. Any of that kind of information is also a sign of a good meeting. On the other hand, signs you're just going through the motions are things like if you're talking more than they are, you're accepting compliments, you're not taking notes, and you're not sure why you're even in the meeting in the first place. You want to take good notes by writing down symbols: excited, angry, embarrassed, pain, goal, obstacle, workaround, background information, feature request or purchasing criteria, money or purchasing info, people and tasks to follow up with. Write down the symbol and also write down a few words, an exact quote if possible, which lets you reconstruct the conversation and share its raw data with your team. There are some signs that you're failing to push for scary commitments by asking that important question, do you want it? Will you reject me or will you give me this thing? The big signs are a pipeline of zombie leads, or a pipeline where you have no idea when anyone is going to close, or if you finish a product meeting with a compliment, meetings which just vaguely went well. All of these things are big danger signs. I find it personally, this scares me. I'm not a natural salesperson. I had to learn all this stuff. I'm a techie. So what I did is I would write down on my note paper, kind of in a shorthand, so my customer wouldn't think it was weird if they saw it, but I would write down what I was meant to be asking for at the end, and then I put a big check mark by it, and if I hadn't asked that, then that check mark's open, and I would know I had really screwed up. So that was how I got over this fear. Your ultimate prep question, which you do ahead of time, is just, what do I want to learn from these people? What's important to my business? What are the risks? What are the questions? What am I trying to learn? Why does this conversation matter? So I hope you found that useful. It's been fun for me. Thank you for listening. There's a bunch of extra information, especially for teachers, if you want to teach this in a classroom or if you want to do a talk or a workshop about it for your team or at a meetup or anything, at momtestbook.com. And if there's anything I can help with, I'm pretty easy to reach. I'm on Twitter at robfitz or on email, rob@robfitz.com. I love hearing about how people use the books, especially if you're trying to share it or teach with it. I'll support universities however I can. Also, my next book is coming out in April 2019. It's about a slightly different topic. It's about teaching and running workshops. If that's something that's in your world, it's called the Workshop Survival Guide, and you can grab it at workshopsurvival.com. So that's it. The biggest ways you can help me, if you feel so inclined, although you certainly have no obligation to do so, is by leaving an Amazon review or just spreading the word. I would love for more entrepreneurs to know how to do this so they don't screw up their first business as badly as I did. Wish you all the best with much love. Bye.